They dropped the hay, first a soft scatter, then a dull thud across the frozen floorboards. Smoke curled low beneath the eaves, weaving between rafters like hungry fingers. Outside, the wind spoke in rattles and knocks, reminding every soul inside why the roof had been sheathed in straw and clay. In these months, straw was as precious as gold, woven into gaps around the doorframe, layered under floorboards, stuffed behind shutters. It was the only buffer between flesh and the void. You could taste winter in the air, a metallic sting that clung to the tongue, a promise of numbness to come. Each breath was a small confession of fear, carried out in white plumes that dissolved against the dark. They called this the dead months, though the bleakness began long before New Year's bells. From the first gray sunrise, if it rose at all, you felt the land retreating, folding itself under snow and ice. The earth itself seemed to sigh, closing its eyes until warmer days returned. Inside the hut, bodies pressed close. A mother counted her children's ribs beneath their shifting blankets, each hollowed curve a tally of what they'd eaten since last harvest. By midwinter, the grain store was but a hollow barrel lined with dust, and every handful of barley felt like sacrilege. Better, she thought, to stretch every scrap of turnip until it knew the taste of hope. Better to confuse hunger with purpose. They had learned to save their words for the hearth. Speech was a flame that burned as surely as wood, every exhalation a surrender of precious heat. So they sat in near silence, the only sound the gentle scrape of bowl on bench, the low murmur of the pot as pottage simmered to something closer to mud than meal. Ragged children sat cross-legged, cheeks reddened by a chill they could not name, eyes glazed with wonder at the play of embers. Old Corin, whose gait had once carried him through summer fields, sat by the door. When he shuffled across the frozen threshold, it sounded like dry leaves. His shoulders bore a stoop that snow had carved in deep grooves. He had watched enough winters to know when a man's bones would shatter like old pottery. He'd laughed once, years ago, when a neighbor claimed no winter could kill him. Now he kept his jokes folded in his sleeve, alongside a carved wooden charm he'd never let go. No one spoke of death, though they saw it in every drifted snowdrift, in the abandoned huts where children's toys peeped from under icicles. They marked the empty spot at table when a neighbor failed to show. A mother missed her goat's low bleat at dusk, and she feared the worst, a frozen fall, a last shiver before the frost. When morning came and the goat did not stir, she pulled her cloak tighter and whispered to herself that kindness had failed, not God. They relied on routine, an armor forged of repetition. At dawn, they rose with the sun, or when the sky's faintest light pressed through the smoke-dark window. Hands stiff, they broke the ice from the bucket and cursed the day's first chore. It was an ache ritual, numb fingertips against brittle water, a reminder that sensation itself was a luxury. Then they gathered scraps for the fire, a shivering handful of straw, a half-rotted log whose heart had rotted to shame. Each spark meant another hour of warmth, each ember a small victory. They layered clothing as one might layer memories, an undertunic, a woolen surcoat, a patched cloak that once might have been green but was now the color of old grass. These were stitched with hope and desperation, patch upon patch, until the garment was less cloak and more tapestry of survival. Every tear held a story. The corner ripped when chasing a chicken away from the hearth. The sleeve shot through by a low-hanging thorn as they dragged wood home. Each needle sewn was a prayer. When the fire was no more than glowing coals, they turned to movement. Feet scuffed the floor, children hopped from foot to foot, and men swayed with axes in cramped rhythm as if dancing with ghosts. Movement kept life in the marrow. Stillness invited frost. Even the cat, a scrappy thing with ribs like a comb, paced near the hearth, its purr a wheeze that sounded like old iron. The harshest truth, there was no end to cold. It was not a visitor, but a permanent tenant. It settled into every crease of fabric, sank into bones, lay in wait beneath blankets. They found it in sweat that froze on the brow, in breathless steps across the yard, and in the hush that came with a long, bitter night. By midnight, the wind had lowered its voice to a hum, as if conserving strength. Inside, candles burned low, wicks hunched over the last drops of tallow. One by one, eyes closed and dreams came, a brief respite in which warmth lived only in memory. Dawn returned not with cheer, but with a sullen sigh. The sky's leaden curtain rose just enough to gray the world. Each figure stirred with the same thought. How many logs left? How many mouthfuls of pottage until new grain? How solid was that old roof under the weight of last night's snowfall? These questions were the marrow of their mornings. In the fields beyond, the dead stubble lay pinned by ice. No plow could break that ground until the mud thawed, and when it did, it would be spring, and just beyond hope. Yet even here, in this realm of bone-white silence, life persisted. Under the snow, bulbs slept. Beneath the frozen soil, seeds waited. The villagers believed that every season survived only by surrendering some small piece of itself. This was winter's toll. Every fallen branch, every frostbitten finger, every soul who did not wake, each was surrendered so that those who remained might greet the green stirrings of spring. When they could spare the breath, they told stories of better winters, stories that grew more ornate with every telling. A year when the river didn't freeze solid, when a lord shared his store of salted meat, when laughter sounded through barns instead of shivers. Such tales were an act of defiance, a declaration that frost would not claim imagination, that memory could burn hotter than any fire. In this time, community was both necessity and weapon. Neighbors showed up at dawn to share an axe. They shivered together in a borrowed barn, stacking wood until their shoulders burned. They took turns tending the embers in the hearth so that no one family bore the whole burden. When a child fell ill, cough rattling like brittle twigs, they carried her to the priest's hut, hoping prayer could break the frost in her lungs. When old Ulrich died, arriving at the end of a single fevered night, they dragged him to the churchyard and covered him with pine boughs that still smelled faintly of summer. But community had its limits. Even the stoutest heart could break under shared misery. Jealousies flared over who had more kindling, who hoarded the last sack of flour. At night, muffled curses drifted from raftered lofts, each syllable a shard of desperation. In darkest hours, some talked quietly of leaving, of trudging south to warmer lands, though they did not know where to find them. They spoke in half words, believing that to name hope was to tempt winter's cruelty. Yet they did not leave. They could not. Their homes were roots sunk into frozen clay. Their obligations, of fealty, of debt, of love, held them in place as surely as iron bands. Each time they stepped outside, they felt the world press against them, urging retreat. But they returned time and again into the wind's teeth, to bring back fuel, to feed the dying flame, to nurse fevers and doubts. Winter was a siege, and every act of survival a refusal to yield. Midwinter's turning came without fanfare. A stray sunbeam lingered on the window pane a moment longer. A thaw whispered through the eaves, dripping from thatch in gentle taps. Each melt droplet carried a message. Nothing lasts forever. They noticed the shift first in their dreams, a warmth, soft and bright, creeping into their sleep. Then in the animals, a hen ventured outside, shaking snow from her wings. A goat nosed through a drift, hungry for grass. They felt it too, in the stir of their limbs, in the faint trickle of hope. But the season was not yet done. Snow would return, and sharp frost would bite again before green showed. So they guarded this fragile reprieve with solemn hearts. They took advantage of every thawed hour, stacking wood, airing blankets, tending wounds. They spoke of spring as though it were a promised gift, though they had learned that hope could be as fickle as a half-lit fire. And still, they endured. They endured because the alternative was unthinkable. Each cracked lip, each blistered hand, each frozen morning, they accepted as the price of belonging to this land, to this community, to this life. In the hush between snowfalls, they whispered to one another that bearing winter was their inheritance. It was written in every scar, in every patch on a cloak, in every story passed by firelight. So they survived. Not with glory or triumph, but with a stubborn, grinding persistence that turned each dawn into a small victory. They survived by counting logs, by rationing meals, by bending their pride until it was thin as straw. They survived by holding fast to one another, by stitching their tattered garments with threads of determination, by keeping the embers alive when hope flickered low. When at last winter loosened its grip and the thaw came for good, they emerged blinking into a world washed clean. Snowmelt ran in rivulets along the path. Songs of birds echoed where only wind had spoken. They felt the sun's heat like a stranger's touch, uncertain if it would stay. But it stayed, and so did they. Hunched and scarred, wary and victorious. They had survived the deadliest months, and in that survival lay a fiercer warmth than any hearth. Their story ended not with fanfare, but with the ordinary. Thawed fields, plowed earth, new seeds sown. They wasted no breath celebrating what they had learned. Winter would return, and with it the trial of their endurance. But for now, they tasted the sweet relief of warmth earned, a hard-won promise that even the longest, coldest night cannot last forever. They left the embers glowing low and returned to the chores. For in the dead months there is no rest beyond the momentary relief of warmth. At dawn, after breaking the ice on the water bucket and coaxing the fire back to life with bark and scraps of straw, every hand turned to food. On most mornings, all that awaited the kettle was a brackish pottage made of cheap grains, oats crushed fine, barley nearly spent, and a handful of dried turnip scraps that had survived rodents and rot. The cook's fingers, red and swollen, fumbled with the lid, and steam rose in black clouds through the smoke hole above. Hunger was present as speech in the hut, constant, insistent, impossible to ignore. Each breath seemed to hollow the belly further, and still they ate in silence, because to speak of hunger was to magnify its ache. They scavenged what they could. A small party, 2 men and a lad, ventured beyond the village boundary to scour the wood for stray branches hidden beneath drifts. Their boots cracked the crust of snow, sending up soft puffs that vanished on the wind. When they found a downed limb, they pried it free, careful not to break their own backs in the attempt. Beneath the trees, they gathered pine cones and knotty roots, which they crushed and burned for heat or boiled for bitter broth. Ice fishing became a dubious luxury. Chipping a hole in the river's frozen surface, they lowered a crude line, flax string with a bent pin, and waited for hours in sub-zero stillness. Every tug on that line carried the promise of fresh meat, but most days the river yielded nothing but cold. Yet even an empty hook was worth the gamble. It was a defiance of winter's monopoly. Inside, women worked the loom and spindle to pass the hours and to guard against the cold. Wool cards and raw fleece lay on benches, and every restless fingertip moved to keep the mind engaged. By midday, the pottage had thickened to near glue, and scraps of stale bread, once baked to golden crust, were broken into the pot to stretch the volume. Children clustered at the edge of the hearth, eyes wide as they sniffed for flavor, each inhaled spice or onion scrap a treasure. No one wasted speech on thanks. Gratitude felt too fragile to name aloud. Better to stoke the fire, to stir the pot, to breathe and keep living. Protein was rarer than warmth. If a family had slaughtered a pig in autumn, the salted meat was hoarded like coin. Strips of bacon dangled from rafters, hidden behind bundles of herbs. But as scarcity deepened, every household eyed its own stores with suspicion. When neighbors fell into debt, grain borrowed and never repaid, some were driven to desperate measures, snatching a ham hock by night, or poisoning a neighbor's stew to mask the theft. Even dirty secrets felt warmer than the chill of suspicion in the air. Rats and mice swarmed in the darkness, gnawing through sacks, leaving fur and droppings behind. Peasants set traps, snap shanks of spare wood tied with string, to skewer the vermin, but for every rat killed, 2 more slipped through the thatch. In the morning, the sharpened corpses lay among rotting grain, and the survivors pressed closer to the warmth of straw and cloth. Vermin were both enemy and sustenance. When hunger pressed too hard, a rat boiled in pottage could serve as crude protein. Such measures were whispered among those too ashamed to admit them by firelight. In the village, people leaned on each other until the walls between households blurred. A mother who could not feed her brood 3 times daily brought her children to the neighbor's hearth, where they sat and ate in quiet solidarity. A laborer whose leg had turned gangrenous after a slip on the ice was nursed by 3 families in turn, fed broth and bandaged with linen torn from old surcoats. When the magistrate demanded taxes in coin or grain, villagers pooled their resources and paid as one, for refusal meant punitive fines that none could afford. In this season, community was less about choice and more about shared desperation. Yet community had its fractures. Rumors spread of a family that hid their last sack of rye, refusing to share even a handful with the starving widow next door. At night, the faint hiss of anger drifted from cottage to cottage, and a pall of distrust settled heavier than the snow. Some villagers held clandestine councils in the loft above the barn, where torches flickered on damp beams and voices hushed conspiracies of mutual aid, stealing from the Lord's granary, planning a mass petition for relief. Others withdrew into themselves, praying that the frost might spare their own hearth before claiming another soul. The church remained a beacon, its candles lit against the gloom, but sermons grew darker. The priest spoke of penance and humility, of trials sent by God to test the faithful. He reminded them that martyrs wore rags and died on crosses of wood, and that their suffering would be rewarded in the next world. His words drifted through the congregation like smoke, visible yet unable to warm. Outside, graveyards froze solid, and the newly dead sank into the frozen ground like leaves beneath ice. Coffins were laid atop the earth, weighted with stones until a thaw might allow proper burial. Superstition crept in with the cold. Husbands marked the door frames with crosses of chalk and etchings of runes to ward off frost wraiths. Spirits said to slip through thatch and burrow into bone, causing limbs to turn brittle and hearts to freeze. Children slept with garlic strung around their necks to repel nightmares that took shape as snarling wolves. Old Corin, still alive at 80 winters, muttered incantations beneath his breath as he chopped wood, claiming it kept the winter at bay. Even those who scorned such beliefs stole home early at dusk, for fear of snow elves that danced in moonlit drifts and lured travelers into crevasses. Yet they found small comforts where they could. At the midwinter feast, scarcely more than a shared crust of barley bread, they toasted the light's return, even though the sun climbed only a degree higher with each passing day. They sang ancient hymns, voice cracking in the cold, and remembered a time when winter meant festivals, masked dances, hot wine spiced with cinnamon and cloves. Those memories tasted of warmth so distant it felt like a dream, and yet the act of recalling them breathed color back into pale cheeks. Stories sustained them. Every night, when the fire guttered and the wind lay hushed, someone would rise to speak of a winter from generations past, when a child in Spain survived on wild grapes under a borrowed cloak, or when a Saxon village bartered its last ox for a load of coals. These tales spread from hut to hut, each teller embellishing, until sacrifice sounded noble and endurance felt heroic. In that darkness, hope was a story best told by a crackling fire. They passed the time by crafting tools and mending clothes. Needles flew through fabric, stitching rags into quilts, clothing into patches, patches into prayer flags. A woman carved a wooden bowl from a splintered plank, inscribing it with spirals that marked the seasons, an attempt to bind the wheel of the year so that cold would one day release its grip. Children whittled scraps of bone into small toys, teaching each other to make hollow reeds sing like flutes. Such trivialities, it seemed, were an act of rebellion, proof that humanity could thrive even in the grip of ice. When the lunar cycle waned, a thaw whispered through the village. A single day of dripping eaves and running water felt miraculous. Women turned laundry troughs into wash basins. Men ventured deeper into the woods to fell green saplings for kindling. They stacked wood in neat pyramids against the barn wall, beneath a covering of tarpaulin and oilcloth to keep off the worst of the snow. Bundles of straw were saved for insulation, laid where wind gusted through the gaps. Each handful of material was a promise that the siege would ease, and yet, as they prepared for this midwinter reprieve, they knew the battle was not over. The thaw would not last. Ice would return with its bitter companion, storms that blotted out the sun for days on end. They braced themselves for another onslaught, fresh drifts to climb, new packs of wolves to keep at bay, creaking beams threatening collapse. They leaned into the work, for they had nothing left but labor in each other. Every swing of the axe, every stitch in wool, every measured ration of grain was a declaration, "We choose to endure." In these dead months, the measure of a man or woman was not bravery in battle, nor riches, nor noble birth. It was the capacity to rise with the gray dawn and face a world that had turned to stone, to gather the smallest scrap of wood, to coax warmth from embers, to cradle a child's fevered face without collapsing under the weight of despair. This was heroism in winter. When storms raged and neighbors fell silent, when the earth seemed to lie in unbroken sleep, The peasants stood watch, and in that watchfulness they forged a quiet strength, one that would see them through the darkest nights and carry them toward a day when snow melted and bones grew warm again. They survived not by divine miracle, nor by feudal mercy, but by relentless human toil, by the rhythm of chopping, stacking, burning, mending, sharing, and hoping. In the dead months, survival was a tapestry of small acts, each one insignificant alone, but taken together forming a garment strong enough to hold a life. And as the frosty dawn broke on another frigid morning, they drew breath, lifted axes, stirred the pot, and once more chose to live. They woke to a world trapped beneath a vault of leaden clouds, the dawn light a sullen gray that drifted through the smoke hole and lay upon their shoulders like a shroud. By now, the ropes beneath the thatch had groaned under the weight of snow for weeks, and every creak signaled a threat, that the roof might collapse or that a lone branch had snapped free beyond the walls, spearing into the silence. Each morning began with a prayer, silently uttered, lest the cold steal their warmth. And then the dull ritual of survival resumed. Water was their lifeblood and their torment. The bucket by the door, once brimming, now lay half empty, its surface sealed by a fine veil of ice that must be broken at dawn. The chore fell to the eldest boy, Thomas, whose small hands shook as he chipped away at the frozen film. Each crack echoed through the hut, a brittle reminder that water, like hope, could be locked away when you needed it most. Once free, the water was poured into the iron kettle, which hung above the embers, and coaxed back to life with twigs and pine bark. Steam hissed upward, sharp and angry, until the pottage gurgled again, a murky brew that tasted of last autumn's root vegetables and the regret of countless hearths. Daylight was a brief visitor. They measured hours not by work or rest, but by the dim arc of light across the rough-hewn table. When the glow receded, they lit candles, stubs of tallow that burned with a greasy flame, and huddled close to the fire. Conversation remained scarce. Words were warmth, and economy of speech was discipline. Yet when voices rose, they spoke not of comfort, but of defiance. "We will not yield," old Corin rasped one evening, leaning on his stump of a chair. "Winter is but a season. It bends, and then it breaks." His words were a spark that danced across their resolve, reminding them that endurance was both shield and sword. By the third week of this third month, the stores of grain had dwindled to a hollow sound when the barrel was shaken. The last handful of oats was reserved for the sick, flesh too weak to digest the thick pottage that sustained the rest. In exchange, a neighbor offered a handful of dried apple peelings, brittle as bone, but sweeter than any feast. They traded promises in place of coin. "Help us mend your roof in spring, and we will spin wool for your cloak." Such barter was more than economics. It was a bond woven from necessity and trust. The fields, long since surrendered, lay silent beneath the drift. The villagers had learned to read the snow's surface for clues. A set of prints might mean a wolf stalking the outskirts. A circular depression could hide a thawed pocket of earth, tempting a root or tuber. A small group, led by Lena the healer, ventured beyond the fence to extract bark from alder and willow, bitter tonics against fevers and coughs. Lena's fingers, knotted with arthritis, moved swiftly, scraping strips of inner bark that would later be boiled into tea. Her knowledge was treasure, a remedy for rattling lungs, a poultice for frostbite. In her presence the hearth felt more than a stove. It was an apothecary dispensing more than heat. In the corner of the hut, children learned the art of patience. They traced patterns in the soot-stained walls, carved simple figures from scraps of bone, and whispered tales of sunlit meadows their mothers described, fields of green grass that bent in the breeze, sunlight that warmed the skin without stinging. In those stories they found solace, images that glowed behind closed eyelids and warmed them better than any tallow wick. Yet not all found comfort in tales. Some lay awake, plagued by phantom drafts that rattled their ribs. Dreams turned bitter. They dreamt of running but never reaching the barn, of water swimming in their mouths only to freeze when they tried to swallow. In the darkness, the villagers shivered not from the cold alone, but from the fear that the winter would never end. In those hours they prayed for dawn, for light, for any interruption of the stillness. One morning they discovered that Ulrich the miller had not stirred. He lay on his pallet, limbs frozen stiff, face turned to stone. The neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, sharing glances too heavy for words. There was no time for tears. They wrapped him in his cloak, patchwork of winter's wear, and carried him outside. The ground refused to yield, but they forced a shallow grave, tipping the earth back into place with frozen shovels. White pines dropped their needles like silent mourners. As they shoveled, they felt the weight of his absence, a gap as vast as a snowdrift. Life pressed on. The mill stood idle, its wheel grounded by ice. Bread was a memory, pottage their daily sustenance. When the village bell tolled, though its clapper rarely moved, it sounded more like a dirge than a summons. The magistrate's rider still came, though his horse's breath was steam in the air, and his message was the same: a levy of 2 eggs per household, or a coin to be paid by All Hallows' Eve. The villagers pooled their eggs, one bright orange offering from Lena's hen, another pale and frail from Marta's clutch, and sent them on. They counted the cost in meager hearths and hollow bellies. At the end of the 4th month, the first birds returned. A lone thrush hopped across a melt stream, its feathers muddy but alive. The sight of it brought tears to more than one eye. They followed its call to the barn, where they discovered a nest of black rats, shivering and starving. With pity and determination, they scooped the nestlings into a basket lined with straw, carrying them to the hearth. Under Lena's careful ministrations, the tiny creatures survived, and their cheerful chirps in the loft above reminded the villagers that life, stubborn as winter, would not let go entirely. Spring, when it came, arrived as a whisper, a thaw in the eastern fields at dawn, turning the crusted snow to slush. The villagers assembled, skeletons in tattered cloaks, faces pale but determined, and set about their tasks. They chipped ice from the communal well, cheers rising as water flowed freely for the first time in months. They dragged saplings to the huts, filling gaps and propping up sagging thatch. They boiled the husks of last summer's harvest into a weak grain broth, tasting grit and promise in each spoonful. Their limbs ached, but they labored with purpose. Every heave of the axe, every stitch and repair, was a claim staked against the darkness they had endured. Children splashed in puddles, laughter ringing as though the sound had been bottled for months. Women shook rugs on fence posts, sending dust plumes into the air, a luxury thefts of winter had never permitted. Men huddled in the sun-warmed yard, trading stories of their struggles, comparing blisters and breakdowns. In the momentary brightness, they seemed to stand taller, as if the touch of warmth had straightened their spines. Yet even as they celebrated, they remained wary. Winter's echo lingered in the hollows of their breaths, in the way they watched the sky. They knew that every thaw carried the risk of floods. Rivers, once frozen, now roiled with meltwater, threatening to carry away fences and storehouses. They knew that early green shoots were vulnerable to late frost, snapping beneath ice that still crept through the night. So they paused between relief and readiness, savoring the thaw while still stockpiling wood, still checking ropes beneath the thatch. In the coming weeks, they prepared for sowing. Oxen, once stabled and fattened for winter's sacrifice, pulled the plow across the softened earth, turning furrows that smelled of damp clay. Seed was sown, hardy rye and barley, oats and peas. Each handful cast into the ground was a vow, that they would endure another cycle, that they would coax life from the hardened soil once more. They worked in pairs, one guiding the oxen, the other casting seed, so that labor and hope moved in tandem. Midday came later now, lifting the veil of cold shadows. The sun, though weak, glinted on old scars, the frostbite lines on knuckles, the cicatrized wrists of those who had fumbled with axes in the dark. These marks were badges of survival. No feudal title carried more weight. They shared their stories by the hearth, now reserved for cooking rather than constant warmth, and spoke of dreams, a new tunic woven from spring's fleece, a basket of fresh eggs, the first tender leaf of nettle harvested for soup. The turning of the seasons was never clean. Snowdrifts still clung to leeward slopes, and winds off the north carried a bite. One dawn, they found 4 sheep dead among the hedgerows, frost chalk etched on their flanks. Lena tended the survivors, draping woolen blankets and feeding them barley steeped in lavender. The loss stung like a betrayal, yet even here, in grief, they found solidarity. The shepherd shared his remaining ration of salted meat with the women who mended his fences. In return, they offered a portion of their grain to fatten the flock. By the time the 5th month unfurled its pale green banner, the huts no longer felt like prisons but like hard-won havens. The thatch was reinforced, the doors oiled, the windows glazed with animal fat to keep out the worst of any late snap. Crofters repaired their axes, pulleys in the grain loft were re-greased, and the mill wheel creaked once more as it turned. Each sound was a declaration. That winter, though savage, would no longer rule. They celebrated with a modest feast, fresh nettle pottage, a slab of reheated salted pork, and honeyed onions from the cellar. They drank sour ale, toasting to hard labor and harder memories. Laughter rose, tentative at first, then louder until the rafters shook with it. The children danced, their bare ankles pink in the glow of torches. For a moment, they tasted freedom. And yet, even as they reveled, they remembered winter's lessons, that warmth must be earned, that stores must be gathered early, that the bonds of community were as vital as any timber frame. Their celebration was tempered by vigilance. Scouts watched the horizon for returning storm clouds, and neighbors agreed to share work and supplies in equal measure. They had learned that mercy from the elements was rare. It must be negotiated through sweat, sacrifice, and solidarity. So, with bellies full and hearts cautious, they looked toward summer. The struggle of winter receded like a bad dream, still vivid, but fading with light. They sowed fields, mended fences, and planned repairs for the half-frozen roof. They spoke of planting orchards, of weaving brighter cloths, of rebuilding the granary walls stronger than before. Each plan was a promise that even the deadliest winter could yield to the living work of a determined people, and as they stepped into the weak sunlight, their breath warm and hopeful, they carried with them the marrow-deep knowledge of what it meant to endure. Their shoulders were straighter not from ease, but from having borne the weight of seasons. Their voices were stronger not from song, but from the silence they had fought through together. They had not merely survived winter, they had been transformed by it, and in that transformation lay the true measure of their lives, unbroken, resolute, and as lasting as the stones they would one day bury in memory of those who did not make it through the cold. Snow melt ran in rivulets through the yard when dawn unlatched itself from the winter's grasp, a wet promise that the world might yet soften. The villagers stepped onto slush that squelched beneath their boots, each footfall a cautious greeting to a thaw they had barely dared imagine. Underfoot, the straw laid against the cottage walls lay sodden and dark. They shucked it away, peeling back the insulation of months to let the walls breathe once more. Inside, the hearth stood cold but unbroken, its stones black with the residue of war against frost. They coaxed coals to life with dry kindling saved for just this purpose, thin twigs bound in waxed cloth, brittle but trustworthy. Flames flickered, hungry for breath, and at once the hut felt less like a tomb and more like a home again. Mothers ladled fresh pottage of nettle and barley, sweetened with a pinch of honey rescued from the spring's first honeycomb. Children, faces tarnished by soot and hardship, tasted the hot broth and found laughter lodged in their throats. The work of repair began at once. Men climbed onto roofs, shoveling off moss-frozen debris and rethreading thatch where the storm had torn it loose. Each handful of straw was lauded as treasure, each knot tied in rope a declaration of vigilance against the next onslaught. In the courtyard, women dumped buckets of water to soak down smoke-blackened walls before scrubbing them with ash and sand. They discovered hidden scrawlings carved by bored hands through the winter, heart shapes and crude runes that spoke of secret longing and fear. With strokes of chalk, they overlaid new marks, crosses of gratitude, spirals of spring, snatches of song. Fields that had lain mute beneath snow now emitted a faint smell of damp pollen. Villagers gathered along the edges, probing the earth with branch handles to feel for thawed pockets. Where the soil had softened, they drove wooden stakes to signal where the plow would carve. Oxen, fattened on beet tops and dried hay, stamped in their yokes, mist curling from nostrils. As the plow turned the first furrow, a hush fell over the watchers. This sound, the scratch of iron on softened clay, was music more welcome than any festival. Seeds were sown by hand, a handful of rye here, a scattering of oats there, each kernel a pact with the land. They spoke the names of ancestors as they cast the seed. For you, old Branna, for your courage, Torvald, for the children who will taste this harvest. Even the youngest helped, their fingers turning gray with mud but never ceasing. A sow's grunts drifted from the pigsty as the animals feasted on sweepings, pulp of turnips, shavings of beet, the last pulp of stored apples. The pig's contented silence was a bell of hope, yet the thaw was not unbroken grace. A sudden wind snapped through the valley one afternoon, whipping at cloaks and scattering fresh seed into gullies. A hailstorm followed, sharp as gravel, pitting the newly turned fields and smashing first shoots. Villagers crouched beneath lean-tos, faces stung, and when the skies cleared, they mourned as they might a lost child's life. Broken dreams pressed into the cracked earth. But then they rose, brushed off frost-rimed hair, and re-sowed the fields, each seed a rebuke to fate's cruelty. In the barn loft, Lena the healer's workshop bustled with resurrection. She boiled alder bark for coughs and dried spruce needles for tea rich in vitamin C. A young mother brought her baby, whose cheek pulsed with the marks of frostbite. Lena carved a salve of rendered fat and comfrey, rubbing it in until the child's face glowed pink, a bloom of new flesh. The mother wept not for pain but for relief, and Lena held her hand like a lifeline. In that moment, the hut felt more than a refuge. It was an infirmary of wonders. At night, they gathered in the yard around a communal bonfire, stoking logs that had dried under eaves for months. Sparks flew skyward like golden insects, and voices rose in old work songs, crooned between coughs and stumbles. Young men, bones still brittle from weeks of chill, danced stiffly, arms looping as if to capture the fleeting flares of flame. Old Corin, leaning on his carved staff, tapped his foot and hummed a tune his grandmother had sung. The melody slipped through the air, knitting the crowd together in a cloak of sound. In the dawn's edge of the 6th month, the river began to stir. Ice cracked at its edges with a dull roar, like a beast awakening. Villagers set up troughs to collect the runoff, filling barrels that would water livestock through the next drought. They repaired nets torn by ice, then cast lines into running channels, pulling out trout glistening with life. Fresh fish, roasted over coals, tasted of clean water and second chances. Children slipped into the shallows, shrieking as the cold bit knees and then laughed at the shock. By midsummer, the field swelled with green. Barley arched its ears toward the sky. Peas climbed trellises. Carrots and parsnips sent leafy crowns above the soil. Rain came in soft scours, coaxing reluctant grass from the banks. Farmers mended fences daily, for stray livestock could devour tender shoots in an instant. They taught their daughters to drive the animals back under yoke, and their sons to bind the new growth for drying. Everything was cyclical, a wheel they turned again after each winter's trial. The granary, once a hollow scar on the hill, was replastered and raised on new posts. Inside, they stacked grain in layers, alternating wheat, barley, and oats to deter weevils. Coarse linen sacks held seed designated for spring. Finer baskets held barley for pottage. They sealed the roof with clay rendered smooth, then painted the exterior with lime wash to reflect scorching sun and keep out pests. The granary's doors, carved with runes for luck, swung open to receive the new bounty. At nightfall, beneath a sky unscarred by clouds, they celebrated the turning of the year's wheel. Tables were set in the open air, long boards stretching between trestles laden with fresh bread, salted ham, soft cheese, and glasses of pink ale brewed with elderflowers. Lanterns hung from ropes between trees, and torches lit a dance floor of flattened grass. People moved in a circle, hand in hand, chanting blessings to the earth and sky. Even the rain god seemed appeased, for no drop fell. Stories were retold with new flourish. Thomas, once the boy who chipped ice each dawn, now stood taller, limping only slightly where frost had claimed his toe. He recounted in teasing tones how the river's ice had cracked under his weight, sending him sprawling into frigid water. Laughter burst from the crowd as he shrugged off the memory, muscles rippling from months of toil. Marta, the potter's wife, shared her prize, an earthenware jug she had shaped and fired with pine needles, its surface etched with winter's silhouette. In the ease of summer nights, they dared to dream beyond survival. Young couples whispered of weddings, planning new cloaks and feasts that would rival the midsummer celebration. Children drew chalk games on flat stones, raced each other in barefoot sprints, and tumbled in hay piles rescued from damp. Plans for orchards took form, apple saplings and cherry trees grafted for sweetness, to stand as living monuments to endurance. Each project was a challenge to entropy, a statement that life persisted despite every frost. Yet they carried winter within them. In every handshake, there lay a gravity born of hardship. In every glance, a caution honed by fear of loss. They retained a ritual of checking backs for bruises, hands for splinters, hair for lice, a remembrance that even summer bore its trials. In the grain stores, they left a small portion sealed, a winter cache for times of scarcity. It was a hedge against memory, a way to say, we will not forget. When autumn winds mingled with the warmth, bringing the first fallen leaves in gold and russet, they prepared once more. They harvested what they had sown, lifting grain-laden sheaves and swaying bundles, flailing and thrashing to separate the kernels. They gathered nuts and roots, preserving turnips and carrots in barrels salted and buried beneath root cellars. Wood was split and stacked again, ropes coiled, thatch gathered. Children ran across cleared paths, ecstatic at the first crisp bite in the air. At each stage of harvest, they paused to bless the yield. A pinch of grain was thrown back to the earth, a ribbon of cloth tied to a young oak as thanks for shade during the summer's glare. The granary doors were sealed with fresh clay, imprinted with handprints and runes that read, "May winter treat us kindly." They lit bonfires on the hilltops, beacons to ward off the ghosts of seasons past. Smoke curled into the twilight, carrying prayers and memories. In the final days before snow's return, the village settled into a rhythm both familiar and new. They had rebuilt, restocked, and reweaved the tapestry of their lives. Yet they did not forget the months of ice that had tested every sinew of their souls. They knew that winter was not merely a trial to be endured, but a teacher whose lessons ran deeper than any sermon. They learned that warmth was not only in fire, but in hands clasped together, that food was not only in grain, but in shared sacrifice, that hope was not only in a thaw, but in the promise of community. And so, when the first snowflakes drifted like lost feathers at dusk, they did not cower. Instead, they stood at their doorsteps, cloaks thrown back, smiles glinting. They watched as the flakes settled on straw, on fences, on the carved runes of the granary. Each flake was a question. "Are you ready?" And the villagers answered with steady breath and steady hearts, "We are." Winter would return, as it always did, with its hunger and its silence, its broken roofs and its frozen tears. But they would meet it as they had met every other challenge, together with blood in their stitches, sweat in their brows, and fire in their souls. For they had survived the deadliest winter, and in doing so, had woven themselves into the enduring fabric of the land. And when darkness fell once more, they would light their torches, stoke their hearths, and carry on, day by arduous day, threat by quiet threat, until the thaw rose again on the edges of the world. They rose before dawn, slipping from straw-strewn pallets into chill air that tasted of smoke and damp earth. The first task of the day was not milk or bread, but a pilgrimage to the latrine. For in a world without pipes or running water, answering nature's call was a deliberate, ritualized act. An act that began with the clink of chamber pot against floorboards and ended in the dank shadows beyond the cottage door. You carried your pot to the door, gripping its rim with mittened hands. The cold metal bit into your palm as you stepped onto the frozen threshold, cloak swirling like a dark tide. Only the bravest ventured far. Most latrines lurked just beyond the byre or behind a lean-to, where a narrow wooden seat perched above a pit dug deep into earth that turned to iron in winter and to sucking mud in spring. There, in that cramped booth, you balanced on scuffed planks, the stink of old waste heavy as wool and worse than 100 barnyard animals. Privacy was a fragile illusion. Walls were thin, made of rough boards nailed to crooked posts, and gaps yawned where wind sneaked in to mock your solitude. From inside, you could hear the coo of doves roosting overhead, the low murmur of village gossip drift through cracks, the thud of goats huddling against barn walls. You closed your eyes against embarrassment, focusing on the ritual. Drop, wipe it with moss or rag, grind sting of cold into breath, drop rag or moss into scrap bucket to be boiled in potash and wood ash later. The cesspit below was a living thing, hungry and foul. Over seasons it filled with excrement, household refuse, and the offal of animals slaughtered for feast or famine. In some estates, a drain of bamboo or hollowed timber led to a moat or river beyond, but in peasant lands, waste piled under floorboards until spring, when young boys with torches descended on ladders to empty the pit into wheelbarrows and haul it to fields as fertilizer. They called it night soil, trading the stench of human waste for grains of coin or a loaf of black bread. Women and men approached this chore differently. Mothers taught daughters to tuck cloaks and skirts away, stepping wide over the plank, while men strode in leggings and jerkins, legs splayed for balance. Yet all felt the same vulnerability, breezes slipping under skirts, the glint of moonlight through cracks, the knowledge that wolves might scent your fear in the dark. Some built 2 cedar latrines, side by side, for couples daring enough to share the breach of etiquette. Others sought the privacy of hedgerows at dawn, jackets lifted like banners, cheeks reddened by exposure and shame. Inside the hall of a manor, things were no kinder. Chamber pots slid beneath thrones of carved oak. Servants waited in adjoining cubicles with pails of ashes and smeared sand to sprinkle on fresh heaps. The lord or lady rang a small bell when nature called, summoning a lackey to clear away the soiled vessel and replace it with a clean one, rim polished to a dull gleam. The ritual was formal. Bow, await removal of pot, nod acceptance of fresh, return to cushion without looking the servant in the eye. Castles boasted garderobes, narrow slits in walls built over drops of 30 feet or more, where waste plunged into the moat or down to the courtyard below. Knights and ladies sat upon stone slabs chiseled smooth by countless cheeks, gazing out, if they dared, over ramparts to rolling fields. Below, dogs and pigs scavenged the splatter, and scraps of meat or offal sometimes followed down, adding rancid bursts to the stink. Winter turned the drop to an icicle of hardened filth. Spring turned it to a river of ooze that seeped into foundations and walls, leaving stains that even the bravest soldier would not scrub away. Monasteries were both refuge and microscope for sanitation. Monks followed a strict rota, 2 at a time, to the latrine, reading passages from scripture in low tones so the sound of their voices mingled with the splash below. Pits were lined with stone, called reredorators, and drained by wooden troughs etched with channels that led waste to nearby streams. Rules forbade talk of smells. Violators were fined a measure of ale or extra prayers. Yet even piety could not tame the stench. Psalms drifted through foul air, notes rising on waves of ammonia and rot. Children learned sanitation early. Boys cheered at the chance to empty night pots, a task that fetched a few copper coins from grateful parents. Girls were taught to sew strips of cloth into small sling-like pouches, reusable soft wipes that, after use, were soaked in lye baths and bleached in the sun. Mothers boiled linen rags with vinegar and ashes to disinfect them, a process that bubbled pots until the kitchen floor was puddled with gray-brown liquid. They poured over cracks in walls, testing for drips or vermin that might carry plague or dysentery into the household. Public latrines appeared in towns, stone vaults built over cess channels shared by dozens. People paid tolls of a farthing to squat on round stone seats carved into arches, side by side with strangers. Privacy vanished into stares and coughs. Seating was communal, with no partitions. A wooden bench ran the length of the room, sloped slightly so waste slid toward the drain. Town criers warned of poison dips, but few listened. Rats swarmed below. Swineherds sometimes tethered pigs beneath city latrines, letting them feast on runoff, growing fat on human scraps. On market days, these taste-tested hogs sold briskly. Winter brought fresh horrors. Frozen waste solidified around planks, turning latrines into death traps. Villagers found bodies fallen into pits when ice thaws revealed rotted limbs. Many refused the risk, resorting to nighttime forays into orchards or open fields. These expeditions were fraught. Watchmen patrolled the hedges to deter thieves, or worse, travelers who might attack those bent over in solitude. Some carried lanterns with covers to mask their trips, but even a flicker speared shadows that could conceal lurking beasts or brigands. Health was tied to sanitation, though medieval theories were crude. Miasma, the belief that disease rose from foul air, led some to light fires beneath latrine openings, hoping smoke would dispel noxious vapors. Others brewed herbs into vinegar and sprinkled it in pits. Charcoal and powdered chalk served as crude deodorizer. Priests blessed latrines monthly, chanting incantations to ward off demons believed to inhabit stagnant waste. Yet dysentery and cholera flared unpredictably, turning villages into charnel houses when pits overflowed and streams ran brown. Come spring, the great cleaning began. Cesspits were capped with planks, straw, and stone, left fallow until summer's heat fermented the contents into rich fertilizer. Young serfs labored with shovels and wheelbarrows, donning coarse leather gloves smeared with tallow. They emptied decades of decay into manure heaps, spreading it over barley fields to coax yields for the coming harvest. They called it black gold, a grim alchemy that turned filth into bounty. They cursed under breath, eyes watering from stench, knowing that every rotten pit fed their families' bellies. By summer, chamber pots sat clean in cupboards lined with fresh straw and herbs, mint, lavender, rosemary to chase away odors. Town latrines were scrubbed with sand and vinegar, wooden seats reversed to scrub the underside. Monastery drains were sluiced with clear water from mountain springs, oyster shells crushed for grit. People slept easier, knowing that pits were shallow, channels clear, but the knowledge was fleeting. Sooner or later, every bucket filled, every pit backed up, every stream sullied once more. Through it all, they endured with ritual, invention, and uneasy humor. They carved crude jokes on latrine walls, graffiti that mocked kings and clergy alike, a think on the stone where nobody saw, but everybody knew. They wept curses over broken pails, hoarded rags and moss, swapped tips on which bushes offered best concealment. They bore the shame and the stink because every human needed release. And in a world without plumbing, every act of relief was a communion with the earth, a stark reminder that life and death flowed through the same channels, unclean, unstoppable, and utterly human. In the towns and cities, the problem of waste became a civic challenge, one that tested the ingenuity and tolerance of an entire community. Narrow streets bustled with life, but beneath the laughter of vendors and the rattle of wooden carts, filth flowed in open drains. These weren't sewers as we know them, but shallow trenches carved into the center of streets, called kennels or runnels. Rain washed excrement, urine, offal, and rotting vegetables down these gutters, creating streams of slurry that fed into the nearest river, where children bathed, where laundresses scrubbed linen, and where butchers dumped blood and entrails by the bucket. People walked gingerly, especially in leather shoes with thin soles. Raised wooden walkways lined some alleys, but most relied on instinct to hop from stone to stone or skirt walls where the runoff was shallowest. Long sticks, sharpened at one end, were used to prod debris out of the way. Even the nobility weren't safe. There are stories of fine ladies stepping from litters into filth, their slippers lost in muck, their gowns soaking up the stink of the street. Above, from windows and balconies, chamber pots rained down. It was not just a comic trope. Gardez l'eau was a shouted warning in French cities, echoed in English towns as where below, or simply a grunt before the contents of the night pot splashed onto cobblestones. In the absence of plumbing, many residents had no choice but to dump their waste out of windows. Laws tried to curb it, mandating nighttime disposal, angled chutes, or covered pots, but enforcement was rare, and even when caught, offenders paid small fines. A pail of urine thrown from the second story might land on a merchant, or worse, a visiting noble. Such accidents were forgiven with a purse of silver or blood. The wealthier homes had garderobes built into walls, narrow chutes that led from upper floors down to pits, but the poor made do with buckets and bedpans. Every morning, apprentices and children carried them out into alleys or directly to the riverside, where they joined a procession of waste-bearers, fishmongers with barrels of bones, tanners with vats of lye-stained hide water, executioners washing blood from blades. The line between industry and excrement blurred until every scent of the city mingled into one. The sulfuric tang of piss, the sweetness of rotting fruit, the iron of blood, the oily rot of old grease, and the ever-present stench of human waste. And yet, amidst the rot, a system emerged. Scavengers, called gong farmers in England, made their living from filth. Dressed in layers of waxed cloth, faces wrapped in linen soaked in mint or vinegar. They descended into cesspits with long-handled shovels and lanterns. Their job was to empty the accumulated waste from beneath taverns, inns, and tenements, some of which hadn't been cleaned in years. The work was deadly. Toxic fumes built up in sealed pits, and more than one farmer suffocated mid-scoop. Still, they were paid well, better than most tradesmen. In London, some earned more than bricklayers or blacksmiths, hauling barrels of waste by night and vanishing by sunrise, ghosts of the city's underbelly. These gong farmers became part of the urban mythos, half feared, half respected. People crossed themselves when they passed, fearing the bad airs clinging to their cloaks. Children dared each other to follow their carts, to peek inside the sloshing barrels, but they were essential, and city charters gave them license to cross property lines, break open walls, even dig beneath cellars when pits overflowed. They deposited their haul in designated dumps on the outskirts of town, where farmers collected the muck to spread on fallow fields. Even the foulest waste was a commodity in a world where soil needed constant feeding, but not all waste was handled with such care. Many houses had simple wooden privies, no deeper than a few feet, built right into their kitchens or attached to the back wall. These pits leaked, rain flooded them, rats tunneled through them. When a pit filled, families either dug another or simply covered the old one with boards and soil. In crowded tenements, it wasn't uncommon for 5 families to share one seat. No partition, no curtain. Disease festered here, spread through flies that feasted on filth and then crawled across bread and cheese. In monasteries, the rules of hygiene were sacred. Latrines, called river-dorters, were carefully maintained. Monks bathed more frequently than most commoners, and their sanitation systems were often marvels of medieval engineering. Cloisters built channels to direct running water beneath their latrines, using gravity and careful design to flush waste into rivers or cesspools far from the main buildings. They understood, at least intuitively, the need to separate living quarters from filth. In some places, these systems rivaled Roman aqueducts in complexity, with lead pipes and aquifers, sluices and overflow vents. The monasteries became sanctuaries during plagues, and their clean habits may have saved many lives, though they still suffered, and their waste too had to be managed. Dedicated lay brothers emptied the latrines, and when the plague came, it was often these men, the lowest and the bravest, who were first to die, having spent their days among the most potent breeding grounds of disease. In villages, sanitation was more personal, more improvisational. People used communal fields beyond the last row of huts, places called the back meadow, piss hill, or simply the edge. These became social spaces of a strange kind, where neighbors nodded awkwardly across the grass, each pretending not to see, the other crouching in silhouette. The edges of forests, too, served this purpose, sheltered by brambles, shielded by trees. Certain trees, bent or gnarled, were even named for their service: piss oak, dung willow, the bog elm. People believed the earth could cleanse itself. They saw waste as temporary, a thing that disappeared with wind and rain, but they also knew the danger. Folk tales warned children not to play near cesspits, lest they fall in and vanish. There were stories of changelings who lived beneath the latrine, of devils that climbed into homes through the holes if you didn't cover them at night. Latrines were liminal spaces, places of transformation, of vulnerability, and of spiritual risk. Women had their own rituals. On feast days or before childbirth, they burned herbs in the latrine: sage, rosemary, lavender, not just for the scent, but to ward off evil. Some left coins beside the pit, offerings to ancient spirits. In parts of rural France, the last person to use the communal privy each night had to knock 3 times on the wooden seat and recite a rhyme to keep away illness. Men laughed at these practices, but many did them too when no one was watching. Hygiene tools were diverse. Where moss or cloth wasn't available, people used wooden scrapers, corn husks, handfuls of straw. In cold weather, these often froze before use, making the task doubly unpleasant. There were even early toilet papers of a sort, scraps of old parchment, discarded prayer scrolls, frayed linen too torn to mend. It was not unheard of for scribes to find their own notes reused in the latrine, smeared and discarded by someone who never learned to read. Cities tried to regulate the chaos. Edicts were issued by mayors and councils, Cesspits must be at least 6 feet deep. Waste must not be dumped into the street. Chamber pots must be emptied at dawn, not noon. Violators were fined, named in public records. In some cases, repeat offenders were exiled from towns altogether, but enforcement was patchy. Bribes were common. And in times of war or plague, all rules dissolved. Streets became rivers of waste, and homes were abandoned with chamber pots still steaming. And yet, despite all this, people found ways to keep dignity alive. They embroidered cloths to cover their pots. They carved initials into latrine doors. They wrote poetry about the morning dump, wry, crude, human. Children grew up learning to balance on the edge of a seat, to brace against walls, to hold their breath and sing a rhyme while doing their business. Adults joked about it, shared horror stories, teased each other about the stink. Sanitation, in the Middle Ages, was not just a matter of survival. It was a mirror to the soul of a world that accepted filth as fact, and yet strove, day after day, to push back against it with buckets, herbs, songs, and stubborn humanity. Not all latrines were private. In the bustling heart of the medieval market, privacy was a privilege few could afford. Communal privies, wooden huts with multiple holes carved into long benches, served entire neighborhoods. These were dark, fly-ridden places, often slick with mud, waste, and spilled chamber pots. A boy might squat beside an old widow, a blacksmith next to a midwife, and conversations sometimes lingered longer than the business itself. In winter, the seats were cold as iron. In summer, they steamed. The smell was unbearable, yet the act was shared, a strange and silent ritual of everyday survival. By morning, these privies were brimming. The responsibility of emptying them fell to the lowest of the low, night soil men. They moved before sunrise, shoveling waste into barrels strapped to carts, rolling through the waking city while others averted their eyes. The clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestone was the sound of civilization dragging its bowels to the outskirts. There, in distant fields or beside city walls, they dumped the day's excrement, sometimes in great pits that festered with flies, sometimes directly into rivers already choked with debris. Those rivers were lifelines and latrines both. In Paris, the Seine bore the weight of a city's filth. In London, the Thames ran black and thick. In Florence and Cologne, Bruges and Ghent, the waterways served every purpose: drinking, washing, cooking, slaughtering, tanning, and relieving. Wooden platforms jutted from banks, some built for fishing, others unofficially used as toilets. Boats drifted past men squatting with tunics hoisted. Washerwomen poured soapy gray water into the same currents where tanners dumped lime-soaked hides and farmers cast animal dung. Everything fed into the river, everything came back from it. The idea of cleanliness in this world was not tied to sterility. It was about appearances, smells, signs. You washed your face, combed your hair, changed your shirt if you had a spare. But waste was woven into the fabric of the street, clinging to the hem of every cloak. A person might go weeks without bathing, yet still hold their head high, still say their prayers, still offer a stranger bread with unwashed hands. Castles had their own answers. The mighty stone walls that protected kings and lords also hid their excrement. Garderobes, stone seats built into turrets or castle walls, emptied directly onto the ground or into the moat. A narrow shaft, worn smooth by time and weather, allowed waste to fall freely into a pit or onto a slope where dogs and rats scurried. In summer, the stench rose like a phantom. In winter, it froze into grotesque sculptures of ice and filth. Moats themselves became open cesspools. Though romanticized in paintings, they were stagnant, oily, and foul, catching not just waste from the garderobes, but scraps from the kitchens, carcasses from the kennels, and every bit of refuse thrown from the battlements. Soldiers standing guard had to breathe the fumes for hours on end. Servants sometimes collapsed from the stench, and during sieges, disease bred faster than arrows flew. In noble homes, chamber pots were made of brass or fine ceramic, painted with floral motifs or scenes from scripture. Some even had inscriptions, a Latin blessing, a joke, a curse against enemies. These pots were stored under beds or in corner cupboards, discreet but ever present. It was the task of servants, often young girls, to empty and clean them. They scrubbed the rims with sand or vinegar, perfumed them with dried lavender, carried them to the back stair where other girls did the same. In winter, their fingers cracked from cold water. In summer, the heat turned the smell to a gagging sweetness. Some castles featured more elaborate arrangements. The Tower of London had a complex of chutes and drains, directing waste downward into the moat. In southern France, stone channels guided water to rinse the latrines after use. Primitive flush systems operated by buckets or diverted rain. The palace at El Escorial in Spain included entire wings designed for bathing and toileting, though this came later. Still, these luxuries were exceptions. Even kings had to crouch over cold stone, robes bunched around their waists, praying the breeze didn't blow their secrets skyward. In monasteries, silence was kept even in the latrine. The reredorer, a shared monk's toilet, was often a long stone bench with multiple holes, backed by a wall where water flowed. No talking was permitted. Each brother entered, did his duty, and left in contemplation. The sounds of splashing and breathing echoed in the dark like a chant. Some monks carved small crosses into the wall beside their favorite seat. Others left no trace at all. The rule of Saint. Benedict instructed monks to bathe as needed, especially when ill or before feast days. In cold climates, bathing was rare, but hand-washing was sacred. Waste was kept apart from living quarters when possible, though in smaller monasteries, proximity was unavoidable. The smell seeped into the stone and clung to wool robes. Yet the latrine was a place of humility, a reminder that even the holiest bowed to the body's demands. Children learned young. A toddler in a peasant cottage was taught to relieve himself on straw, or in the dirt beside the hearth. As they grew, they graduated to the family's pit latrine, often little more than a hole dug in the yard, covered with a wooden board. The seat was shared by siblings, cousins, even grandparents. Privacy didn't exist. A child's fear of falling in was real. Some wore leather straps around their waists, tied to a parent's wrist, just in case. In cities, children often relieved themselves wherever they stood. Street corners, gutters, stairwells, alleys. It was a common sight to see a child squatting in the shadow of a cathedral, ignored by passers-by. Some cities employed men with whips to chase them away, but the practice never stopped. Waste was too constant, too universal, too human. Washing afterward was another matter. Water was precious, especially in winter. People wiped with moss, leaves, hay, linen scraps. In cities, when the weather allowed, they rinsed at fountains or stood bare-bottomed by the riverbank. In homes, bowls of water were shared among family members, one for hands, another for face, and if possible, a third for rinsing after the toilet. Soap was rare and expensive, made from lard and ashes, and reserved for the truly filthy or the very rich. But even amidst the squalor, there were moments of strange elegance. In a merchant's home in Lubeck, a privy was discovered built into a closet, lined with painted tiles and perfumed with dried oranges. A handwritten poem was found on the wall, dated to 1389, verses about love and digestion written with humor and grace. In a villa outside Milan, a noble woman kept a silver comb beside her toilet seat to tidy her hair before returning to guests. In a remote English manor, a lord commissioned a latrine with windows so he could gaze upon the garden while he sat. To the medieval mind, defecation was not shameful. It was simply a fact. It carried no more moral weight than sneezing or coughing. The body expelled what it must, and the world absorbed it in turn. What mattered was ritual. What mattered was place and order and doing what needed doing without complaint. Yet over time, complaints did rise. By the 14th century, petitions flooded city councils, begging for better sanitation, for enclosed privies, for deeper cesspits. In London, the law forbade dumping waste within 12 feet of a neighbor's wall. In Paris, ordinances required households to maintain their waste chutes and clean their gutters weekly. Enforcement was weak, but awareness was growing. People were beginning to notice that where filth piled high, so too did illness. Still, the solutions were temporary. Waste, like life, kept flowing. Through every crack in the cobblestones, through every wooden floorboard, through every chamber pot tipped at dawn, the medieval world endured its own unending tide and found, in the muck, a way to carry on. By the closing centuries of the Middle Ages, filth had become not only a nuisance but a specter. The rising tide of waste pouring from 10,000 windows and chamber pots was no longer just a stain upon the street. It was a threat, a danger, a quiet killer hiding in the gutters. The connection between waste and disease was not yet understood in terms of bacteria or hygiene. Germs were unknown, but people began to notice patterns. Where the smell was strongest, sickness came faster. Where the water was blackest, children coughed harder. Death followed waste like a shadow. In the cramped back alleys of Hamburg, barbers and butchers tossed entrails and old blood into the same gutters that carried urine from brothels and night soil from homes. The stench in summer was unbearable. Rats ran in waves. Flies blackened meat before it could be sold. And when the plague came, it took them all, rich and poor alike. Waste clung to their boots, their robes, their deathbeds. Across Europe, cities struggled to cope. Public bathhouses, once centers of health and social life, became suspect. Officials began closing them, fearing they spread infection. The bathhouses, like the rivers, had been both sacred and profane, places to clean the body, yes, but also to gossip, to flirt, to sin. Now they lay abandoned, their steam turned to silence. And so the people adapted again, as they always had. Cesspits were dug deeper. In some towns, barrels were lowered into them to collect waste more efficiently. Tanners began using the ammoniac properties of urine to soften hides with greater control. Pottery workshops collected old chamber pots, fired them again, and sold them secondhand. The waste became a resource, however repulsive. In cities like Nuremberg and Bruges, architects experimented with vertical drainage, building homes with privies on upper floors, using wooden or stone chutes to guide waste downward. In theory, this separated human waste from human noses. In practice, the chutes often cracked, leaked, or froze in winter. One burst pipe could coat a kitchen with filth in seconds. It was in monasteries and universities that the seeds of understanding began to grow. Scholars curious about health and the humors started recording observations. They noted how bad air, miasma, rose from rotting waste and seemed to bring fevers. They wrote about the importance of airflow, the cleansing power of herbs, the need to separate latrines from wells. Still, superstition reigned. People burned bundles of rosemary and sage to ward off the smell of death. They carried pomanders, spheres filled with crushed flowers and spices, hanging from their belts to purify the air. The rich paid to have their garderobes lined with fragrant woods. The poor rubbed garlic on door frames and prayed for mercy. In villages, old customs endured. Children were taught to avoid certain bushes said to be cursed with bad spirits. Latrine spots long abandoned but never forgotten. Women gathered ashes from hearths to sprinkle into chamber pots, muting the smell. Men relieved themselves behind barns or under hedges, always watching for the priest, or worse, their neighbor's wife. At fairs and festivals, temporary privies were built, holes dug hastily and surrounded by canvas. These soon overflowed, their contents seeping into the ground beneath the dancers' feet. And still the music played, the ale flowed, the fires crackled. People laughed with waste between their boots and never thought twice. It was not shame that kept them from talking about excretion. It was familiarity. Every living soul, from bishop to beggar, knew the rhythm of their body. They knew the need, the relief, the consequences. A man might fight a war, build a chapel, or write a poem, but each morning he would squat above a pit like everyone else, breathing the same air, hearing the same splash. In this way, the toilet became the great leveler of mankind. And yet, even here, social class found a foothold. In noble courts, the position of groom of the stool was born, a servant whose sole responsibility was to attend to the monarch's toilet needs. He prepared the chamber pot, handed the cloth, ensured the king's comfort. It was a position of rare intimacy and trust. The groom knew the monarch's humors, habits, and diet more than any physician. His presence was constant, invisible, essential. For queens and noble women, the task fell to ladies-in-waiting. They assisted with the layers of clothing, held perfumed cloths to the nose, and whispered stories to distract. The toilet, even for the royal, was never entirely private. It was attended, observed, managed. In the courts of Burgundy, toiletry became almost ceremonial. Elaborate seats were crafted with velvet cushions, curtains, and embroidered canopies. Some had small trays for books or prayer beads. It was not uncommon for a noble to receive a visitor while seated upon one, conducting affairs of state between bodily affairs. But outside those halls, most still used the woods, the trees, the fields, the edges of the known world. Nature was always there, offering relief and risk alike. A peasant woman might squat behind a haystack while threshers worked nearby. A shepherd might disappear behind a thicket, scanning for wolves with trousers down. In winter, the snow hissed beneath their waist. In spring, the mud swallowed it whole. Even in the heart of towns, nature returned in strange ways. Ivy grew over the backs of abandoned privies. Rats tunneled beneath latrines, stealing warmth and food alike. Stray dogs lapped at puddles that no one dared name. Waste did not disappear. It transformed into soil, into sickness, into memory. There were stories, passed from mouth to mouth in firelight, of children falling into cesspits and returning changed, of ghosts haunting abandoned garderobes, of demons that rose from latrine holes on All Hallows' Eve. Superstition fed on waste, like worms in the dirt. But behind the fear was always truth, that to live among waste was to live with death, closely, daily, patiently. And still, they survived. Generation after generation, they endured the stink, the filth, the crude systems of their time. They invented, adapted, ignored. They cleaned when they could, tolerated when they must, and joked when all else failed. Humor was the shield. A man might say, "The devil took my health but left my bowels." A woman might laugh, "If the Lord made me, he made me leaky." By the dawn of the Renaissance, whispers of new ideas stirred. Engineers looked to aqueducts, to flowing water, to underground channels. The concept of the sewer, an organized, buried vein of the city, began to take shape. But that was for another century, another chapter. For medieval people, the world of waste remained immediate. They lived atop it, beside it, within it. They knew its warmth in winter, its weight in summer. They carried its smell in their hair, its stain on their shoes. It was as much a part of life as a bread or breath. And perhaps that is the final truth. In a world without plumbing, where castles and cottages alike echoed with the same needs, waste was not merely something to be removed. It was something to be understood, managed, survived. And in surviving it, they told us something profound, that civilization is not built on gold or glory alone, but on the quiet, unspeakable act of cleaning up after ourselves, one pit at a time, one chamber pot at a time, one silent squat in the cold dark at a time. They lived with the smoke, breathed it, slept in it, raised their children beneath its thick, silent weight. It clung to the thatch, to the rafters, to the woolen cloaks drying by the fire. The very walls were stained with it, not just the wood and wattle, but the very air, soaked in a darkness that never fully lifted. From sunrise to moonrise, smoke ruled the home. Not the kind that wafted gently from a candle or the thin curl from a pipe. No, this was a suffocating bitter thing, born from green wood, wet dung, and whatever scraps of fuel could be gathered from hedgerow or dung heap. It poured from hearths without chimneys, rising straight into the center of the roof, where it churned and swirled and settled, searching for any hole to escape. Most medieval homes had no flue, no proper vent, just a small smoke hole at the top, often clogged or blocked by thatch, birds' nests, or sheer bad design. Smoke would gather in great black wreaths beneath the ceiling beams, floating just above head height, forcing the inhabitants to stoop or sit low to avoid the worst of it. Eyes stung, throats burned, the babies coughed in their cradles, and still, the fire had to burn. Fire was life. Without it, the bitter winters became death. Without it, bread went unbaked, water undrawn, pests unchecked. And so the fire roared day and night, devouring anything that could catch. Peat, straw, sticks, the dried bones of last season's beast. In villages where trees were scarce and wood too costly, cow dung was kneaded and dried in the sun, then fed to the flames. It made a long burning fire, but it filled the home with a smell that stained the soul. There was no escape from it. The smoke became a second skin, a scent that seeped into the very pores. Travelers who entered a peasant's home stepped back choking. Foreigners in markets recoiled from the stench of a dozen households, clinging to every cloak and coif. But for those who lived in it, day after day, year after year. It was simply the way of things. Invisible, inevitable, and then there were the rats. They came with the straw, with the grain sacks, with the carts that rolled in from the fields at dusk. They lived in the thatch above and the rushes below, a skittering shadow world within the home's hollow shell. They were not feared, not really. They were simply there, like the lice, like the smoke, like the cold. A medieval home was not a fortress against nature. It was a hollow in the earth, a pause in the wind. The walls were thin, wattle and daub, plastered over with mud and straw, sometimes reinforced with dung. The floors were dirt, or worse, packed layers of old rushes soaked with years of spills, waste, and sweat. It was here the rats nested, beneath the broken reeds, behind the wooden boards, under the sleeping mat of a child too tired to care. They fed on crumbs, on spilled barley, on the remains of last night's stew left cooling in an open pot. And when food grew scarce, they fed on each other. Their squeals were a lullaby, their scratching, the pulse of the night. They crept over limbs as people slept, gnawed at salted pork hanging from low rafters, carried fleas from one bed to another. And yet, they too were part of life. A good housewife learned to live with them, to place traps, to keep sacks high, to shake out her skirts and brush down the rushes. Cats, when there were any, were both beloved and essential. A strong tomcat might earn its place in a home as surely as any son. But not every household had one, and not every cat could keep up with the breeding. Rats weren't just a nuisance, they were a sign, a symptom, a whisper that the house itself was decaying from within. The average medieval home, especially that of a peasant, was never built to last. Timber was scarce, stone a luxury. Most cottages were thrown up quickly, patched with mud, covered in thatch, and left to lean with the wind. After a few winters, the beams warped, the roof sagged, the walls cracked, smoke slipped in where wind once blew, and rats slipped in where food once lay. Some tried to repair, others simply built anew, beside the ruins of the old, on top of old bones and rotting straw, layers of life and death and ash. The past never left, it just sank deeper. Inside these homes, privacy was a myth, a single room for many souls, parents, children, grandparents, livestock. In winter, the pig might sleep by the door, the chickens beneath the bench, the goat tied near the hearth for warmth, and where there were animals, there was feed, and where there was feed, there were rats. The smoke helped, some believed. It kept the insects down, killed the mold, preserved the meat. A smoky home was a safe home, some whispered. Let the air be black, at least it is dry. Let the rafters vanish in soot, at least they are strong. Let the eyes water, at least we are alive. Children grew up playing beneath these fumes. Grandmothers spun wool by the flickering fire, squinting through the haze. Women cooked over open flames, their skirts dangerously close, their lungs filling with every breath. Men sharpened blades, patched boots, and recited prayers while ash floated through the air like snow. There were houses where the smoke was so thick it seemed to have shape, a ghost in the rafters, a shadow on the wall. The beams above, charred from decades of fire, held the weight of generations, and the walls, darkened and cracked, held every word ever spoken within them. Smoke preserved the memories, even as it choked the life. The rats watched it all. From the beams, from the corners, from the straw-lined nests behind the hearth. Their eyes glinted in the firelight, unblinking. They knew the rhythms of the house, when the people ate, when they slept, when they screamed, when they died. They watched and they thrived. Sometimes, when a body was left too long, they came to feed. Sometimes, when the grain was all gone, they turned to desperate things. But even then, the people rarely fought them. They were too tired, too used to it. Better to place a bit of food outside. Let the rats eat their fill elsewhere. Better to make peace than war in the dark. The churches told people that this was the price of sin, that suffering was holy, that the smoke was a penance and the rats a test. Some priests sprinkled holy water in homes. Some offered relics, bones of saints to keep the pests at bay. But the rats did not care, nor did the smoke. Holiness meant little to them. They were older than prayer, older than houses. And so the people lived, in smoke and shadow, in squeaks and sighs. They built their lives around the fire and within the walls of their low, humble homes. Every breath they took was heavy. Every step they made was watched, and still they laughed, they sang, they married and mourned and prayed for a better season. Because in the end, the smoke and the rats were not the worst of it. They were just the beginning. The sun rarely pierced the gloom inside a medieval home. Even at noon, when daylight was strongest, only a pale, reluctant light crept through the narrow slits that passed for windows, if there were windows at all. Most were simple holes, stuffed with oiled parchment or animal bladders, cloudy and stiff. They let in a little light, a little air, and a great deal of cold. The smoke never left. It hung in place like a ghost too tired to depart, a living veil that coated everything in its path. The children coughed in their sleep. The elderly wheezed and faded faster than they should have. Lung ailments were common, but they had no names then, no cures, only the dull realization that some people simply did not wake in the spring. Every home told a story, not just of its owners, but of the land itself. In the village outskirts, where the poorest built their homes from refuse and dreams, there were dwellings so bent with age they leaned like drunks after a long night. Walls bulged outward, doors hung crooked. The smoke inside was so thick it left rings on the rafters, like tree lines in reverse, each a record of a long, hard winter. These homes weren't sealed off from the world. They breathed in whatever the earth gave them, dampness, rodents, insects, stench. Gaps in the wood let the wind cry through the nights. Rain found its way through broken thatch and trickled into bowls hastily placed beneath. People patched what they could, with mud, with rags, with prayer, but the house always won. And in this vulnerability, the rats grew bolder. They came not just for food, but for shelter, for warmth, for the closeness of human life. They were drawn to the fire's heartbeat, the soft bedding, the salted fish and barley loaves hidden in cupboards. And when their numbers swelled, they did not scurry in the shadows. They walked openly, climbed beams, dropped from the roof, made their nest in boots and bread bins in the folds of forgotten blankets. A good housewife waged war daily. She would sweep out the old rushes, the rotting floor coverings filled with excrement, food scraps, bits of bone, and replace them with fresh ones, laced with sweet-smelling herbs if she could afford them. Lavender, rosemary, wormwood, not just for fragrance, but as a plea to whatever gods might hear, to keep the sickness at bay, to lull the rats into staying away, if only for a while. But still, they came. Always. The church might thunder against sin, but it was the rat that brought the true reminder of mortality. They chewed through the cradle's legs, they stole milk from bowls, they scuttled over the faces of sleeping infants. Their fleas nestled in furs and woolens, and when the plague came, as it did in time, it rode on their backs, a death carriage of fur and teeth. No one understood the connection. Not then. They believed the sickness was in the air, in the stars, in the wrath of God. And perhaps in some way it was. The homes were full of death even before the plague came, hidden in the smoke, in the breath, in the constant damp. The fire never went out. Even in summer, a low flame burned, for cooking, for boiling, for driving out the damp that clung to everything. But the smoke it made was unkind. It stung the skin, settled into clothes. Children with fair hair turned soot brown before they could learn to speak. And when winter returned, the fire grew. So too did the smoke. In towns, homes pressed against each other, stacked and leaning, blocking sunlight and trapping smells. Smoke poured from every rooftop like sighs of despair. The alleys between houses were choked with filth, vermin, and the echo of coughing. In some places, neighbors shared chimneys or built homes without them entirely, using the space for something more useful. Another bed, a storage corner, a goat stall. And the rats? They thrived even more in the towns. There were more homes, more food, more warmth. Grain stores were their paradise. Bakeries, a dream. The dark corners of a tanner's workshop or a cloth dyer's shed became palaces of fat and shelter. And they learned. Oh, how they learned. When the baker's boy left a door open, when the stable boy forgot the feed sacks, when the cook stepped out for just one moment, they learned the rhythms of human error. And they multiplied. in noble homes, it was little better. Castles had more stone, yes, bigger fires, better roofs, but still the smoke, still the rats. More space meant more places to hide. Servants' quarters, undercrofts, larders filled with salted meats and soft cheeses. Rats dined well in castles. They left bones behind, gnawed through cloth of gold, crept across tapestry, and whispered in the ears of dreaming lords. And in the peasant huts, in the hovels built beside frozen fields and muddy paths, there the rats danced openly. People slept in clusters, for warmth, for safety. A mother curled her body around two children. A man lay with a dog at his feet. A newborn nestled near the fire, wrapped in cloth woven by a grandmother who could no longer see clearly. And still, through all this closeness, the rats came, sometimes alone, sometimes in twos, sometimes in such numbers that a scratching sound became a song, and the smoke curled above it all, a gray halo of suffering. There were those who tried to fight back, men who set traps with careful precision, women who laced corners with poisons when they could afford it, families who kept terriers, trained to kill at the squeak of a shadow. But none of it ever truly worked. For every rat that fell, 3 more came. For every nest burned, another formed within the hour, because the houses themselves invited them. They were warm. They were full of hiding places. They were woven with straw, built with gaps, softened with decay. They were wombs for vermin, sanctuaries for smoke. Everything about their structure, from the open hearth to the dirt floor to the thatched roof, whispered, "Come in, stay a while." And so they did. The rats weren't afraid of people. Why would they be? They had lived beside them for centuries. They had outwitted traps, leapt over cats, stolen from lords and beggars alike. They knew every corner, every crack. In many homes, they knew the children by name, though the children didn't know theirs. And so the people accepted them as part of life, as a curse that could not be lifted, as nature's tax upon their existence. The smoke remained as well, and over time, people told stories of its necessity, that it cured meat, that it kept away spirits, that it hardened the beams and made a house strong. They began to fear the absence of smoke more than the presence of it. A house without smoke? It was empty, cold, lifeless. And so they breathed it in, as they had done for generations. Because what was the alternative? Silence, stillness. A house without fire was not a home. A home without life attracted death. And so, better to live with smoke and rats than not to live at all. In the hush of pre-dawn, the village was still, but the homes were not. Within those hunched silhouettes of wood and thatch, life stirred under the veil of smoke and filth. A child shifted on a straw mattress damp from sweat and leaking roofs. A dog growled softly in its sleep, and in the corners, just beyond the fire's reach, the rats began their morning patrol. They moved like shadows, fluid and practiced. They had been born in these homes, raised in them, grown fat on porridge crumbs, beetle-infested bread, and anything else their keen noses uncovered. The boundary between man and pest had long blurred, and in the eyes of the rats, the homes were theirs. But the people didn't live in ignorance. They lived in tolerance. Survival was not about winning, it was about enduring, about learning to exist in the stink of smoke and the sound of scratching in the walls. There was no fantasy of cleanliness, no illusion of conquering the crawl of life. The home was a compromise, a fragile shelter from the chaos outside, and a truce with the chaos within. Some households tried to bring order. They hung herbs from beams, sage, rue, tansy, not just for smell, but for superstition. They believed certain plants kept vermin away or warded off plague. The scent of rosemary was thought to purify the air. In better homes, dried orange peels, cloves, and resin might be burned to chase out the stench. But these were temporary acts of hope. The rats returned, the smoke never left. In many dwellings, the hearth was central, not just in position, but in ritual. All life revolved around it. It was where meals were cooked, bread was dried, water was warmed, wounds were tended. It was where stories were told, secrets whispered, where births began and lives ended. But the hearth, for all its warmth, was also the source of suffering. Few homes had chimneys in the early medieval period. The fire sat open, breathing directly into the room, its smoke rising to the rafters and spreading outward like a slow, suffocating mist. There was no escape. The rafters grew black and wept tar. The air turned thick and sour. Eyes stung, throats burned. Children grew up coughing, lungs coated in ash before their second teeth arrived. Later, some houses would evolve, chimneys added, smoke holes carved. But even then, the drafts were unpredictable. A wind change could turn a well-behaved chimney into a funnel of misery, and the poor, more often than not, had no such luxury. Their hearths remained naked and their lungs blackened, but the fire was still sacred. Extinguishing it, even for a day, was unthinkable. To lose the fire meant cold, hunger, and vulnerability. A home without a hearth was a dead home. So the smoke was tolerated, explained away, wrapped in meaning. In some regions, people believed the smoke kept away demons, that the thick, curling fumes obscured the soul from evil spirits. Others claimed it preserved the timbers, hardened the beams. Some even said the smoke strengthened the children. That coughing built resilience like an unseen baptism of heat and pain. These beliefs were not born from ignorance, but from necessity. When there is no cure, you learn to bless the disease. Outside, the streets were no better. Mud roads turned to sludge with each rainfall. Human waste and animal filth mixed freely, tracked into homes by boots and hooves alike. Rats dined just as well in the streets as they did in the kitchens. And when they grew bold, they moved between houses as if they owned the village. They passed through holes chewed in door frames, climbed rough walls with ease, burrowed beneath floors and between thatch. If they died, they rotted where they fell, their bodies feeding flies, their fleas seeking warmer hosts. Cats tried to fight them off, but not all families could feed a cat, and many feared them, for superstition turned felines into witches' familiars. Dogs fared better. Some were kept for ratting, lean, vicious creatures trained to kill on sight, but they too brought mess and fleas, and often more warmth for the rats to seek out. In some cases, rats would chew the ears of sleeping dogs, and the dogs, too exhausted to fight, would barely stir. People laid traps, crude contraptions of wood and bait. They made noise at night to scare the vermin. They beat pans, sang songs, banged on the walls. But the rats were not afraid. They had lived through such rituals for generations. In the wealthier homes, there were different problems. Stone walls trapped cold instead of smoke, and rats nested in storerooms lined with grain sacks and salted meat. Kitchens in great halls were large and bustling, and thus ripe with leftovers and spills. Where people feasted, rats followed. Servants would sweep and scrub, but the rats always found the scraps. A morsel here, a crust there, a dropped piece of goose fat between the rushes, and the rushes themselves, changed only every few weeks or even months, were perfect nests. In many homes, the rushes were never fully removed, only layered anew. Beneath the fresh herbs and reeds lay a compost of filth, food, and feces. Rats nested deep inside it, unseen, their young nurse just beneath the feet of dining nobles, their high-born laughter echoing above generations of parasites. No one was immune. Even monasteries, places of prayer and discipline, were plagued. The monks slept in dormitories where smoke drifted through narrow flues. They kept cats when they could, prayed when they couldn't, and scratched their skin in the candlelight, wondering if the itching meant lice or worse. The rats knew no God, feared no man. Children grew up within this chaos and called it normal. They learned to recognize the rustle in the walls, to wake before the rat reached the crust they'd saved under their bed, to swat fleas with the back of a spoon, to breathe shallow when the smoke grew thick, and in time, they too became adults. They built homes just like the ones they'd escaped. They used the same fire pits, thatched with the same straw, raised children under the same beams, now blackened and bowed, and so the cycle continued. Rats and smoke were more than nuisances. They were parts of life, like hunger, like cold, like faith. The presence of either was no longer questioned. The fire gave warmth and pain. The rat brought disease and company. Both were ever present, always watching. Some chroniclers, writing from stone towers with ink-stained hands, looked down upon the peasant huts and described them as pits of squalor. And in many ways, they were right. The air was foul, the walls thin, the floors alive. But those homes held something the towers did not: resilience. Because despite the coughing, despite the scratching and smoke and stink, life went on. Bread was baked, songs were sung. Children were born beneath smoke-darkened beams and suckled beside sleeping dogs while rats gnawed the rafters. It was not romantic, it was not tragic, it simply was. And in that simplicity was something stronger than stone. The people did not wait for salvation. They did not dream of plumbing or clean air. They lived in the now, in the embers, in the damp, in the gnawed edges of their reality. And when one child died, another was born. When the roof sagged, they patched it. When the rats grew bold, they banged the walls and hoped for sleep. They did not conquer their world, they endured it. And in enduring, they left behind something greater than comfort, the unbroken thread of survival, woven through smoke and carried on the backs of those who knew how to suffer well. There were no blueprints, no architect's hands guiding the shape of the common home. A peasant's house was born not from design, but from desperation. Walls raised from earth and timber, roofs thatched with straw, reeds, or heather, whatever the land offered freely. Floors made not of stone, but of trodden dirt, compacted by footsteps, moistened by leaks, and thickened with the residue of life. The house was never sealed. It breathed. The walls creaked. The roof leaked. Gaps let in the cold, and the cold brought with it pests, damp, and rot. There was no insulation, no barrier between the family and the elements. And yet, that breath, the draft through a cracked board or the flicker of air beneath the door, was also the only escape for the smoke. When fires burned low, the smoke clung low too. It drifted down, not up. It coated the faces of the sleeping, settled on the hair of children, soaked into blankets and skin. The house smelled of burning and sweat, and in that haze, the world shrank. Reality became in the size of a single room. For most peasants, a house was just that, a single room. The same space for eating, sleeping, praying, birthing, bleeding, and dying. Privacy did not exist. Modesty was learned not by separating space, but by averting eyes. Generations slept together. Human bodies curled beside animal ones, infants in baskets, grandmothers by the wall. The bed, if there was one, was shared, and beneath it, rats. Even in the night, there was no peace. The rats were never still. They moved with purpose, climbing rafters, chewing through ropes, finding bowls left too close to the wall. Some chewed the corners of books or stole feathers from sleeping hens. Others bit. It was rare, but not unheard of. A child would wake screaming. A mother would find blood on her infant's cheek. But there was no cure, no counsel to appeal to. You set another trap. You muttered another prayer. And when plague came, the rats did too. Fleas, bloated with filth and sickness, rode on their backs like reapers in miniature. They jumped to man, to beast, to child. They burrowed under tunics and cloaks. They fed, and as they fed, they killed. Entire families withered within weeks. The very homes meant to protect them turned into tombs. Low, smoky, infested crypts. Some villagers burned the houses down afterward, not for revenge, but for safety. Ashes could not carry plague. Others tried to purify them with lime or herbs. Few succeeded. Still, the houses were rebuilt, always in the same spot, with the same wood, the same straw, the same holes. Nothing changed quickly in the medieval world. Even in towns where buildings clustered together and trade hummed through narrow alleys, the problem of smoke and rats persisted. Shops and homes were one and the same. A weaver worked beside her sleeping child. A baker's oven smoked into the rafters above his bed. Rats traveled across roofs, dropping down from thatch to grain sacks. In inns, travelers shared space with fleas, lice, and worse. The concept of pest control was crude: beatings, baits, boiling water. Sometimes superstition replaced science. Some hung charms by their doors to ward off rats. Others believed that by never naming the rat aloud, calling it the long-tailed one or the thief of the night, they could prevent its return. These were not fools. These were desperate people armed only with belief, and belief sometimes was all they had. Those who lived in castles and manor houses fared differently in comfort, but not in cleanness. Their homes were grand, yes, but drafty, leaky, and sprawling. Fires smoked within stone hearths. Servants swept rushes embedded with food scraps and chamber pot spillings. Rats thrived in the walls, in the kitchens, in the cellars beneath. Even the royal court could not escape infestation. Records tell of feasts interrupted by scurrying paws, of rats bold enough to invade banquet halls, of noble women lifting their hems as vermin darted beneath the table. Traps were set, cats were employed, still they returned. Rats were not a sign of poverty, they were a sign of humanity. Wherever people gathered, to eat, to sleep, to cook or pray, the rats followed. They were creatures of opportunity, and the medieval world gave them all the opportunity they needed. And then there was the fire, the ever-burning, ever-smoking heart of the home. It cooked the meat, yes, dried the clothes, boiled the herbs, but it also warped the wood, blackened the ceiling, and never let lungs forget its price. Some people, in desperation or ignorance, lit fires of dung. Others burned green wood, heavy with moisture, belching out smoke in great choking clouds. Chimneys were rare and rudimentary. Smoke holes often failed. The smallest breeze could fill the room with ash. And so people adapted. They hung their meat in the rafters, letting the smoke cure it. They stored herbs overhead, letting the scent mix with the soot. Children grew up blinking in the haze. Elders wheezed and coughed, not from sickness, but from a lifetime of inhaling their own hearth. A house that wasn't smoky felt wrong, empty, haunted, but it wasn't just physical suffering that defined these homes. It was endurance. It was memory, layered in soot. Every beam darkened not just by flame, but by time. Every corner gnawed not just by rats, but by the years. A house held stories, it absorbed them, it told them. The black patch by the hearth, where a father slipped with the stew. The beam with the notch carved by a child long buried. The smell in the corner, where a sick one slept through his last winter. These were the fingerprints of life. Messy, painful, real. And the rats, for all their horror, were part of that life. In the dark hours of the night, when silence fell over the village, their sounds continued. Scratching, gnawing, breeding, living. They were the background noise to survival. They did not represent failure. They represented truth, that even in suffering, life finds a way. To live in a medieval house was not to control your world, but to submit to it. To recognize that the walls were thin, the floor was dirt, and the ceiling always seemed a little too low. That the smoke stung and the rats would never leave. But you lived anyway. And that perhaps was the miracle. Not that people found comfort, but that they endured discomfort with such quiet strength. The peasant mother nursing her child while the smoke curled around her face. The old man spitting into the fire while rats rustled underfoot. The young girl mending a torn shift beside the hearth, listening to the coughing of her brother behind her. These were the unseen saints of survival. They didn't need perfect homes, they didn't dream of palaces. They needed only shelter from the cold, warmth from the fire, and the strength to rise again each day beneath a roof that leaked and smoked and harbored rats. But that was still a home. And that home, however small, however squalid, held the most human thing of all, the will to go on. The ground was hard, not just firm, frozen, brittle, the kind of cold that made wood crack and metal stick to flesh, the kind of cold that made digging feel like breaking stone with your bare hands. And yet, when someone died in the depths of winter, someone still had to dig. Death was not a guest that waited for spring. In medieval villages, when the breath of December wrapped around every thatched rooftop and the snow made the world quiet, people still died, sometimes more than in any other season. Starvation, sickness, childbirth, war, exposure. Winter was not just a season, it was an executioner. And for the poor, death did not come with dignity. There were no silk-lined coffins, no marble tombs, no procession of candles through a warm cathedral. The dead of the lower classes, of the peasants, the beggars, the outcasts, were sent into the earth as humbly as they had lived, wrapped in what cloth remained, buried in what ground could be broken, mourned by those who were not too cold or too hungry to weep. Sometimes there wasn't even a priest. Imagine a village at the edge of the forest, a place where the wind howled not just through the trees, but through the very bones of the people, where firewood was precious and meat had not been seen in weeks. A child dies of fever, or a mother during childbirth, or an old man quietly in his sleep. And then the question is asked, not aloud, but in glances and silence. Where do we put the body? The churchyard, if there was one, may have been full. It may have been locked. It may have been reserved for those with coin. And the poor rarely had coin. In some places, paupers' plots were carved into the edge of sanctified ground, less a final resting place and more a tolerated pile of the forgotten. In others, the poor buried their own. The process was brutal, not sacred. First, someone had to dig, often a young man, or two or three. They would go out early, when the sun barely lifted through the white sky, and begin to chip away at the earth. Sometimes they brought boiling water to pour into the ground, trying to soften the frost. Sometimes they burned straw over the site before digging. Sometimes they simply hacked and prayed. It could take hours, all while the body, wrapped in sackcloth or a blanket or nothing at all, waited nearby, frozen in its stillness, stiff, pale, and silent. Death in winter did not rot quickly, it preserved. There was no smell, no rush. The cold did what embalming never could, but that cold was also the enemy. For the living, standing too long outside could numb the fingers to the point of pain. Frostbite was not a word they used, but a fate they feared. To bury someone meant to brave that danger, to risk your own life in the name of someone already gone. There was no glamour in it, no ceremony. If a priest could be found, and if he agreed, he might mumble a prayer, a simple Latin phrase, half lost in the wind. If he could not, then the burden fell to the family. A father might say a few words, a wife might sing a hymn. More often, there was only silence, the kind of silence that says everything and nothing at all. Some graves were shallow. The deeper the earth, the harder the work. And when the ground refused to yield, the dead were laid close to the surface. Sometimes rocks were piled over them, sometimes not. Dogs, rats, foxes, they came when hunger called, even to the dead, and so the poor buried their dead quickly, a simple hole, a wrapped body, a prayer, a stone perhaps if there was one to spare. But usually, nothing, no marker, no name, just earth returned to earth, the living returned home, and life in all its misery went on. But there were worse cases. When a village suffered famine, or plague, or war, the dead could come faster than the ground could receive them. Then, the poor did what they had to. They dug mass graves, trenches, pits, a dozen bodies stacked like firewood, sometimes more. No time for rituals, no strength for grief. They cried if they could, but often they couldn't. Tears freeze quickly in winter. In such moments, children were told not to look. Mothers held infants close, shielding their eyes from the sight of burial. But the smell, faint, sweet, and bitter, would rise even through the frost. And children remembered, no matter how tightly they were held. Even those who buried their kin alone, far from any priest or plot, knew death had rules. The poor were not ignorant. They feared the spirits of the unburied. They feared ghosts, wraiths, revenants, and so even when they could not afford a proper grave, they buried as best they could. They turned the body east toward the sunrise. They laid it with hands folded. They muttered prayers, if not aloud, then in the mind. Sometimes they placed stones in the mouth, sometimes coins, sometimes iron nails, not for payment, but protection. Burial was not just about the body, it was about the soul, and even the poorest man feared what might happen if the soul was not at rest. But not all were so lucky. Some died alone in the woods or on the road or in the corner of a hut, unknown and uncloned. These bodies, if found, were burned or buried hastily or left for the animals. In winter, even carrion was food. The idea disgusts us now, but hunger has no morality. And then there were those who were denied burial altogether. The excommunicated, the unbaptized, the suicides. For them, there was no consecrated ground, no priest, no prayer. The poor, if they loved them, still buried them in forests, crossroads, moors, places where spirits wandered and graves went unblessed. These burials were done in shame and fear, but they were done. because even in disgrace the dead deserved a grave. The poor knew this better than anyone, because death did not care how much you earned. It did not care how you prayed. It came with the cold wind and stayed as long as it liked, and when it left behind the same weight, the same body, the same grief. In winter, that grief was heavier, because it had to be carried through snow, because the ground fought back, because the living, shivering in their rags, could only offer so much to the one who would never feel cold again. The earth was not kind. It swallowed the poor the same way it swallowed kings, but with less ceremony, less warmth, and less memory. There are no monuments to these dead, no stone angels, no poems, only fields perhaps where the grass grows oddly thick, or woods where the ground sinks just slightly underfoot. They are gone, but they were here, and in winter they were buried by hands just like theirs, rough, red, and shaking. Hands that still had to chop firewood after the grave was filled, still had to fetch water, still had to wake the next day and begin again. Because death might take one, but winter demanded much more, and those who lived had no choice but to keep moving. The poor did not have cemeteries the way nobles did. They had common ground, or borrowed ground, sometimes even stolen ground, and what little they had, they often had to defend. In harsh winters, with the ground frozen and hunger gnawing at every family, even burial became a source of conflict. The village churchyard might be full, but the villagers still came, dragging their dead behind them on crude sledges or carrying the wrapped corpses in twine-bound arms, stiff and heavy as logs. And when they arrived, they begged, or argued, or fought. The church keeper might refuse them, not out of cruelty, but because there was no space, or because the family had no coin to offer, or because the body was not baptized, a newborn taken too early, or a child born to a mother no priest had married. In some villages, these rejections sparked quiet rebellions. A father, denied a plot for his daughter, might return at night and bury her anyway. In a corner of the graveyard, beneath a tree, where the ground sloped and no one would notice, a brother, turned away from sacred ground, might dig a shallow grave along the boundary wall and cover it with stones, hoping no dogs would come. In other places, death was less personal, more mechanical. When a winter plague struck, dysentery, influenza, or something unnamed, bodies piled faster than shovels could move. The poor were told to wait, to keep their dead inside or outside or hidden beneath blankets until a gravedigger could arrive. But gravediggers died too, and so the work fell to anyone strong enough to hold a spade. In some towns, groups formed, not always official, but known. The death men, they were called, or the diggers. They were boys too young for guild work, or widowers too broken to care. They went house to house, offering to take the bodies for a crust of bread or a pair of gloves or nothing at all, and they dragged them out, quietly, carefully, through snow and mud and black ice. Sometimes the children followed behind, crying. Sometimes they didn't. The dead were taken to burial pits, long trenches dug outside the village walls, where the ground was less claimed and the church looked the other way. The pits were not deep, they were not marked, they were temporary until spring, or so the villagers told themselves. But spring often brought more death, and so the pits became permanent. They filled with the poor, the forgotten, the invisible, and yet, even here, humanity remained. Some placed flowers, dead flowers, brittle from the frost, but flowers nonetheless. Some carved initials into nearby trees. Some came at dawn or dusk, just to kneel, just to remember, just to speak a name aloud. The poor had no marble, but they had memory. They also had rituals, strange ones sometimes, but born from desperation. In parts of northern Europe, the poor burned certain herbs beside the graves, believing the smoke would carry the soul upward. In others, they placed bread or beans in the pockets of the dead, food for the journey like in the ancient days. And in the far reaches of the countryside, where Latin meant little and priests visited rarely, folk spells were whispered over the graves, words handed down from grandmothers, words said with shaking voices and frozen lips. Let the frost hold you and not the worm. Let your sleep be quiet and not awake. The dead were buried quickly, always quickly, but they were not forgotten. Stories grew around these winter burials. There were tales of frozen hands reaching from the ground to beckon the living, of children who wandered too close to the old pits and returned mute or ill or never at all, of bones that refused to stay buried, pushed up by frost heaves or clawed up by animals or simply found in places they did not belong. And so, out of fear and reverence, the poor created boundaries, small stones arranged in circles, bundles of twigs tied into crosses, rags hung from tree branches nearby, markers not for God, but for spirits, for the dead who might return if not respected. Some left offerings, not because they believed the dead could eat, but because it felt like the right thing to do. A bit of broth, a piece of bread, a carved toy for a buried child. These offerings froze quickly, but they were left all the same. Even in grief, poverty did not excuse ritual, and yet sometimes ritual was all they had. Because when a man lost his wife and had no shovel, he might carry her to the edge of the woods and cover her with stones, and he might weep as he did it, not just for her, but for himself, for the shame of such a burial, for the loneliness that would follow. And when a mother lost a child, one of many, she might wrap the little body in her own shawl, even if it was the only thing she had. She might whisper lullabies as she walked to the burial pit, and she might stay until the snow began to fall again, because even the poorest wanted to believe their dead were at peace. Some believed winter was a better time to die, that to die in the cold was cleaner, that the soul froze as it left the body and shattered into the stars, that snow buried sins as well as flesh. These were not church teachings, but they comforted, and sometimes that was enough. The church did not always approve. In sermons, if the poor attended, priests warned against superstition. They scolded the living for leaving coins or herbs or whispered charms. They reminded the faithful that only holy rites could save a soul, but the poor had long learned to trust their own ways. When the church door was locked, they buried anyway. When the priest refused, they prayed alone. When holy ground was denied, they sanctified the earth with their tears. They did not have much, but they had love and grief and hands that dug even when frostbite set in. And so winter buried them all, in time, the living and the dead wrapped in snow and silence. The ground froze, the winds howled, the rats vanished, the wolves came closer, and still the dead were buried. Sometimes, in spring, the frost would lift and reveal what had been hidden. A foot gnawed by animals, a skull half buried in a field, a bone, pale and clean, lying beneath a hedge. Children found these things. They played with them. They asked questions, and their parents told them not to speak of it, to leave the bones alone, to let the dead lie, because they were poor, and someday they would join them. The poor spoke little of death in daylight. It was not because they feared it, not in the way the rich did, with shrines and masses and golden reliquaries, but because death had become ordinary, familiar, an unwanted companion at the hearth, whose breath you felt every morning as frost clung to your ceiling. The children knew it too. They knew when someone was dying, even if no one said so. They could hear it in the cough behind the curtain, in the silence of a room where there should have been snoring, in the way their mother clutched her apron tighter and didn't speak their name that day. Death didn't come with ceremony, it came with quiet, and in winter the quiet came early, sunset by 4, then dark. In that dark, a candle might flicker near the dying, if the family could afford wax. More often they died in the shadow, wrapped in old wool, beside the fire if they were lucky, or in a straw bed where mice scurried near their feet. Their last breath was not witnessed by a priest, but by a child, a sister, a friend, and once they were gone, the waiting began. The body stayed where it lay, cold as the floor, still as the spoon in the pot. There was no embalming, no sheet-draped ritual. The body was left untouched until the morning, and when morning came, it was not reverence that stirred the family. It was necessity. A corpse could not remain indoors, not in the one-room huts where 7 people might sleep on a shared mattress of hay, not where food simmered over coals and the stench of death mixed with soup, not where the youngest still crawled on the floor, too small to understand that the body was no longer a person. So they prepared them, not with hymns, but with hands. The hands of a daughter, wiping the mouth with a damp cloth, the hands of a neighbor woman, plaiting hair or tucking it beneath a bonnet, the hands of a cousin, tying the jaw shut with a strip of linen so the mouth wouldn't fall open like a scream. They wrapped the body tightly, old clothing, wool, rags, anything to keep the limbs together and the form respectable. A child might be placed in a basket, an adult in a sheet, bound at the feet and shoulders with rope. There were no coffins for the poor, only shrouds. Some families stitched crude crosses into the cloth, others marked the head with a smear of soot or the symbol of a sun. Ancient habits lingering beneath a Christian veneer. Then came the hardest part, moving the body. If the ground was too frozen, there was no point walking to the graveyard. The earth would not yield, and if the graveyard was closed or full or too far, the family faced a choice. They could keep the body, sometimes for days, outdoors if they had space, in a shed or beneath a lean-to covered in sacks or straw. If it snowed, better, the body would remain frozen, preserved, safe from animals for a time, but not always. Stories told of dogs finding the dead, of foxes sniffing them out beneath the hay, of pigs escaped from their pens, chewing at the fingers of an uncle or sister, the bones found later in the mud, and so they guarded the bodies. They placed stones atop them, or sat vigil beside them at night, not out of superstition, but out of a desperate, helpless love, until the day came when the ground softened, even a little, and someone offered a spade, then the burial. There were no hearses, no pallbearers. A sled might be used, or a handcart, or nothing at all. Just two people carrying the body by its corners, slipping over icy paths, breath fogging the air, speaking nothing. If it was far, they took turns. One walked ahead, watching for holes or frost patches. The other dragged behind. Sometimes a child followed, barefoot in the snow. They didn't cry. The cold froze the tears before they reached the chin. At the graveyard, if they were allowed, the hole had already been dug, or half dug, a shallow scrape in the white crust of earth, barely deep enough to hold the weight. They lowered the body in. No ropes, no platform, just hands letting go. Some spoke, a word, a prayer, a whisper. Most didn't. The wind howled louder than their voices anyway, and when the body was covered with dirt or snow or a blanket of straw, they turned and walked away. Not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't afford to linger. Home waited, children waited, hunger waited, and the dead did not complain. In the poorest hamlets, there weren't even graveyards. The church was too far, the land too steep, the people too few. So they buried their dead wherever they could, by riverbanks, in fallow fields, along forest edges, behind the house where the frost held longest and the ground was softest in spring. They built little fences around them, not of wood, which was precious, but of stone and bone and broken tools, anything to mark a boundary between the living and what lay below. And when the wind blew through those makeshift cemeteries, it sang through holes in the metal and cracks in the stone. Some said it was the voice of the dead, others said it was only winter, speaking its cold and endless language. Still, traditions emerged. Each family had its own rites, passed down through firelight and story, the turning of a cup, the planting of a root vegetable atop a fresh grave, the placing of 3 stones, never 2, never 4, as a sign that the soul had passed. They did not know why, but they did it anyway, because when you had nothing, ritual became everything. Even if no one remembered your name, they might remember how you were buried, and in that there was a kind of dignity. Some winters were worse than others. The winter of 1316 was called the Great Famine Winter. The rains had not stopped for months, the crops failed, the grain turned black with rot, and when the cold came, it came like vengeance. People died in droves, not from frostbite, but from hunger and sickness and despair. Entire families were found dead in their huts, curled together like nesting birds. In some villages, the living refused to bury the dead at all. Too afraid, too weak, too numb. The bodies froze in place. And when the thaw came, the stench was unbearable. The church sent envoys to dig mass graves, but the envoys died too. So the poor did it themselves. No prayers, no records. Just pits, 10, 20 feet wide, where the bodies were stacked like firewood. Men, women, children, all frozen, all silent, all forgotten. Yet not quite. For years after, the villagers avoided those places. They called them cursed, not because of spirits, but because of memory. Memory of what it meant to survive when others did not, to be the one who buried the child, the wife, the friend, to live with the sound of shovels in your sleep, to know that your own grave might not be so different. And so, even in survival, the poor carried the dead with them, not in coffins or tombs, but in their breath, in their gait, in the way they sat silently by the fire, staring at the flames like they saw something inside them. They didn't need gravestones, they had memory, and memory, for the poor, was sacred. The snow kept falling, the world kept turning. The children who had watched their fathers dig graves became fathers themselves. They taught their sons the weight of frozen soil. They taught their daughters to wrap the dead gently even when the world was cruel. And so the cycle continued. The living buried the dead, the poor buried their own. And in winter, every act of burial was an act of rebellion. Against the cold, against the hunger, against the silence that tried to erase them. A declaration, we are here. We lived. We remember. Winter did not end with a thaw. It ended with a silence. Not the silence of death, but of waiting, of listening for the first sound of dripping water, of bird song, of earth softening underfoot. Sometimes it came in February, sometimes not until April. But even then, even when the thaw began, the buried dead remained. They lay beneath snowdrifts that melted slowly, their outlines briefly visible in the hollows of the ground, beneath crude mounds, some sunken, some disturbed by the paws of hungry beasts. And for the poor who survived the season, there was one more duty, the duty to remember. They returned to the graves when the air warmed. They cleared away the straw and branches that had hidden the resting places. They swept with brooms made of sticks, gathered stones from the forest, planted tiny things, snowdrops, onions, wild garlic, not because they were beautiful, but because they grew, even in the dirt of death, even in the frozen soil where someone's brother or child now lay. There were no gravestones, only the memory of a footpath, a bent stick, a knot of yarn tied to a fence post. But the survivors remembered. Each mound had a name in their minds. Each shape in the field whispered a face. Sometimes they spoke to them, not loudly, not like prayers, just small words. I'm still here. We made it through. I remember. There was a kind of peace in that, not the peace sold by the church with Latin and incense, but the peace of survival, of continuing on even when all warmth had gone, of carrying the dead not in one's arms, but in one's breath. And yet, not all who died were buried. Some poor folk died alone. They collapsed on the road between towns, frozen stiff, eyes open. They died in barns curled behind sacks of oats. They died in forests while collecting firewood and were not found until spring, when crows led the way. These were the forgotten dead, no shroud, no blessing, no name. Only the earth received them, the snow wrapped them, the roots consumed them. And when they were found, their bones were scattered, stripped clean, bleached white. Some feared those dead. They said their spirits wandered, angry, that if you took their possessions, a belt, a coin, a button, they would follow you through dreams, that the wolves who sniffed their skulls gained a taste for human flesh, but others honored them. If a woman found such a corpse, she might bury it with her bare hands. If a man stumbled upon a child's bones, he might recite a psalm. If a boy saw a dead stranger's face, he might carry the image with him forever, because even the forgotten dead had once been someone, had once stood where the living now stood, had once survived a dozen winters before this final one. And so the poor did what they could, not grand things, not noble things, just small, sacred things, yeah. A crust of bread left near the woods where someone died, a candle burned in the snow, a stone placed atop another, like a tower against time. Even in the cities, among stone buildings and tighter walls, the poor struggled in winter. There, death came differently, not with silence, but with noise, the coughing of 100 people in one alley, the cries of orphans, the crash of carts on frozen cobblestones, and when someone died, they were dragged to the pauper's grave. These were not places of rest. They were pits, deep, reeking, dug outside the town walls. No names, no sermons, just bodies, tossed in with haste, layer upon layer of the anonymous dead. The poor buried their own there too, sometimes with dignity, more often with dread, because these places were watched by rats, watched by dogs, watched by men who traded in bones. Yes, in cities the dead were valuable. The bones of the poor were harvested by resurrection. Men, grave robbers who sold bodies to surgeons who used them for study. The dead did not sleep. They were stolen, split, boiled, examined, and the poor knew this, so they buried in secret when they could, behind inns, beneath stables, in the foundations of ruined chapels. They poured salt into the mouths of the dead. They tied their ankles with twine so the spirit would not wander. They whispered things, ancient things, to keep the soul anchored in place. For them, burial was not just duty, it was protection, protection of the dead from the living, and of the living from the memory of what they'd done to survive. Not all winter burials were grim. In some villages, the death of a neighbor was a rare moment of unity. If a person had no family, the community stepped in, not with wealth, but with presence. A woman might lend her only candle. A boy might carve a wooden token to place beside the body. A crippled man might walk a mile on crutches just to say goodbye. Because even the poorest among them understood one thing: to die alone was the greatest cruelty, to be buried alone even worse. And so they shared the burden. They shared it not just with hands, but with memory, with song. Low songs hummed through teeth, old melodies whose words had long been forgotten. Tunes passed down from grandmothers who lit fires with their breath. Songs that said, "We do not forget, we do not abandon. We bury with love, because one day we too will be buried." Even in the coldest parts of Europe, the Baltic, the far north, this truth held. There, winter burial was a test of strength. The frozen ground could not be pierced without fire. So the poor lit fires, not cremation. They could not afford to burn a body, but fires around the site to warm the earth enough to dig. They labored for hours, and sometimes when they could not dig, they built cairns, great mounds of stones under which the body was placed, safe from animals, from frost, from memory's erosion. In these places, wolves howled all night, but the poor buried their dead anyway, because not even wolves could frighten them more than forgetting. And what of the children, the little ones who died before their second winter? For them, the burial was even more tender. They were swaddled like they had been in life, tight, warm, bound, placed in wooden boxes or baskets, sometimes with a single toy, a carved horse, a doll's eye, a pebble from the river. The mother often carried them to the grave herself, not weeping, not screaming, just walking, one foot after another, as if still rocking the child in her arms. And when she placed the body down, into snow, into soil, into sleep, she did not say goodbye. She said, "Wait for me," because she knew another winter might take her too, and then they would be together, in a place beyond cold, beyond hunger, beyond all that was cruel in this world. The poor did not write these things down. They had no books, no parchment, no ink, but they remembered. They remembered in the way they lit fires, in the way they sang lullabies, in the way they paused at certain trees or stones as if someone stood there still. And that was how they buried their dead in winter, not just with frostbitten fingers, not just with shovels and ropes, but with memory. And memory was the only thing the cold could never take.